You have never once seen the world as it is. Every color you have ever seen, every sound you have ever heard, every solid surface you have ever touched is a construction your brain builds inside the sealed darkness of your skull, assembled from signals that bear no resemblance to the experience they produce. The redness of the rose is not in the rose. The light reflected by the rose has no color at all, being merely electromagnetic radiation of a certain wavelength, and the redness is something your brain manufactures and projects onto the experience, a quality that exists nowhere in the physical world, but only in the experience that your brain constructs. Out there, in the world, there is the rose reflecting light of a certain wavelength, and there is the light traveling to your eye, and there are the signals traveling from your eye to your brain. And nowhere in any of this is there any redness, the redness appearing only at the end, in the experience that the brain constructs, a quality added by the brain that corresponds to nothing in the physical process that produces it. The sound of the music is not in the air. The air carries only pressure waves, vibrations of molecules, with no sound in them, and the sound is something your brain manufactures from the signals that the pressure waves produce in your ear. Out there, in the world, there are only the vibrations of the air, the pressure waves spreading from their source, and there is nothing musical about them, nothing that sounds like anything, the sound and the music appearing only in the experience that the brain constructs from the signals, the world in itself being silent, filled with vibrations that have no sound until a brain constructs the experience of sound from them. What you call reality, the world of colors and sounds and solid objects that seems simply to be there, present and obvious and independent of you, is a construction that your brain builds. And the question that this raises is one of the most disturbing that a human being can ask. If everything you experience is a construction your brain builds, then what is the world really like? And have you ever once perceived it as it actually is? The disturbance is not that the world is unreal, for there is a world, a physical reality, that exists independently of you. The disturbance is that you have never directly perceived it, that everything you have ever experienced has been a construction your brain built, a model assembled inside the skull, so that the only world you have ever known is the model, and not the reality that the model represents. You have lived your entire life inside this model, taking it for the world itself, never once stepping outside it to compare the model with the reality, because there is no stepping outside it, the model being the only access you have ever had to the world. The contemporary science of perception has established that perception is not the passive reception of the world, as it is but the active construction of a model of the world, a model built by the brain from the signals it receives and shaped by the brain's expectations and assumptions as much as by the signals themselves. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the world as it appears is not the world as it is, that the appearances are constructions or projections that conceal the deeper reality. The recognition that the contemplative traditions developed through the examination of the relationship between the appearances and the reality. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that perception is a construction and the contemplative recognition that the appearances are not the reality is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the neuroscience of perception, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the relationship between appearance and reality, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The contemporary science establishes that perception is an active construction, that the experienced world is built by the brain from the signals it receives, that the world as it is perceived is the brain's model rather than the world directly seen. The contemplative traditions, examining the relationship between the appearances and the reality through the lens of contemplative reflection, arrived at the recognition that the world as it appears is not the world as it is, that the appearances are, in some sense, constructed or projected, concealing a reality that is other than they suggest. That the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions both arrived at the recognition that the experienced world is not simply the world as it is. The science, through the investigation of perception, and the traditions through contemplative reflection, is a striking convergence, even as the two articulate the recognition in their different terms, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. Your brain is locked in the dark, silent vault of the skull, reconstructing an entire world from faint electrical signals that arrive along the nerves. This is the situation that the rest of this investigation will return to again and again, the situation of a brain that builds an entire world from signals while never directly touching the world it builds. Consider the situation of the brain. It is sealed inside the skull, in complete darkness, in complete silence, never directly touching the world, never directly seeing the light or hearing the sound or feeling the surfaces that it seems to perceive so directly. The brain itself has never seen light, has never heard sound, has never touched a surface. It sits in the bony darkness of the skull, bathed in fluid, receiving only the electrical signals that travel to it along the nerves, and from these signals it constructs the entire experienced world, a world of light and sound and texture that the brain itself, sealed in its dark vault, has never directly encountered. The vividness and immediacy of your experience of the world, the sense that you are in direct contact with a world of colours and sounds and solid objects, is itself a construction of the brain, which builds the experience of direct contact, even though it is sealed away from the world, receiving only signals, never directly touching the reality that it seems to perceive so immediately. All that reaches the brain is a stream of electrical signals, the firing of neurons, signals that arrive along the nerves from the eyes and the ears and the skin, signals that are all of the same basic kind regardless of whether they come from the eye or the ear, differing only in which nerves carry them and in their patterns. This is among the most remarkable facts about perception, that the signals carrying the experience of light and the signals carrying the experience of sound are, in themselves, of the same basic kind, electrical impulses travelling along nerves, the difference between seeing and hearing, residing not in the signals themselves, but in which part of the brain receives them and what it does with them. If the signals from the eye were routed to the part of the brain that processes sound, you would hear the light, and if the signals from the ear were routed to the part of the brain that processes vision, you would see the sound. The experience being determined not by the signal, but by how the brain interprets it. This has been demonstrated in cases of sensory substitution, in which signals from a camera are delivered to the skin or the tongue, and the brain, after a period of adaptation, comes to construct from them an experience that functions like vision, the brain extracting the visual information from signals delivered through an entirely different sense, the experience, depending on the information and its interpretation, rather than on the particular sense through which it arrives. From this stream of electrical signals, all of the same basic kind, the brain constructs the entire rich world of experience, the colours and the sounds and the textures and the shapes, the whole vivid world that seems to be simply present around you. The brain is like a prisoner in a windowless cell, never seeing the outside world directly, constructing its entire picture of the world from the faint taps that arrive on the walls of the cell, building from these signals an entire reality that it then experiences as if it were the world itself directly perceived. This image of the brain as a prisoner reconstructing the world from signals that arrive on the walls of its cell will recur throughout this investigation, for it captures the situation of the brain with a precision that is difficult to overstate. The brain has no windows. It does not look out upon the world. It sits in the dark, receiving signals, and from these signals it builds the only world it will ever know, a world it constructs so seamlessly and so convincingly that it experiences the construction as the direct perception of an external reality, never suspecting, in ordinary life, that the vivid world it experiences is its own construction rather than the world itself directly seen. The contemporary science has established that the signals reaching the brain are radically impoverished compared to the rich world of experience that the brain constructs from them, that the brain adds enormously to the signals, filling in and constructing and interpreting, so that the experienced world is far richer and more detailed than the signals that the brain receives. The contemplative traditions recognize that the experienced world is a kind of construction or projection, that the mind contributes to the world as it is experienced, that the appearances are not simply given but are in part the work of the mind. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the brain constructs the rich world of experience from impoverished signals and the contemplative recognition that the mind contributes to the experienced world is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the neuroscience, while the contemplative traditions articulate the mind's contribution in the terms of the relationship between the mind and the appearances, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind contributes to the experienced world, that the appearances are in part the work of the mind rather than simply given by the world, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the mind is not a passive mirror that simply reflects the world, but an active power that shapes the world as it is experienced. That the contemplative traditions recognize the mind's active contribution to the experienced world, and that the contemporary science has established that the brain constructs the rich world of experience from impoverished signals, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the contribution in the terms of the mind's shaping of the appearances, and the science understands it in the terms of the neuroscience of perception, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The recognition that perception is an active construction rather than a passive reception is not new, but was articulated with precision in the 19th century, in the work that established the foundations of the scientific understanding of perception. The physician and physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, working in the middle of the 19th century, articulated the framework that perception involves what he called unconscious inference, the recognition that the brain does not simply receive the world but infers it, drawing conclusions about the world from the signals it receives, the conclusions being reached unconsciously and automatically, so that the inferred world is experienced as if it were directly perceived. Helmholtz, who made fundamental contributions to physics and physiology alike, recognized that the image formed on the retina is two-dimensional, flat, and yet the world we perceive is three-dimensional, full of depth and distance, the depth being something the brain infers rather than something present in the retinal image, the brain reconstructing the three-dimensional world from the flat image through an inference that draws on assumptions about how the world is structured. Helmholtz recognized that the signals reaching the brain are ambiguous, that the same signal could be produced by many different states of the world, and that the brain must therefore infer which state of the world is most likely to have produced the signal, the perception being the brain's best inference about the world, rather than a direct registration of it. The same pattern of light on the retina could be produced by a small object nearby or a large object far away, by a dim light seen directly or a bright light seen through a filter, and the brain must infer which is the case, drawing on its assumptions about the world to arrive at the single perception that it experiences, the ambiguity of the signal being resolved by the brain's inference rather than by the signal itself. The framework established that perception is an inference, a conclusion drawn from incomplete evidence, rather than a direct registration of the world, the brain inferring the world from the signals and experiencing the inferred world as if it were directly perceived. This recognition, that perception is inference rather than reception, was among the most consequential in the history of the science of the mind, for it transformed the understanding of perception from a passive registration of the world into an active process of inference, the perceived world being the conclusion of an inference rather than the direct disclosure of the reality. an inference that is usually accurate enough to be useful, but that is, in principle, fallible, capable of being wrong. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the experienced world is the product of a kind of mental activity, that the mind shapes the world as it is experienced, that the appearances are constructed by the mind rather than simply received. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as unconscious inference and the contemplative recognition of the experienced world as the product of mental activity is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the inference in the terms of the neuroscience of perception, while the contemplative traditions articulate the mental activity in the terms of the mind's shaping of the appearances, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the experienced world is the product of mental activity, that the mind infers or constructs the world rather than simply receiving it, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the mind is active in the constitution of the experienced world, contributing to the appearances rather than merely registering a world that is simply given. That the contemplative traditions recognize the experienced world as the product of mental activity, and that the contemporary science has established perception to be a process of unconscious inference is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the mental activity in the terms of the mind's shaping of the appearances, and the science understands it in the terms of the inference that the brain performs, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The qualities that seem most obviously to belong to the world, the colours and the sounds and the tastes and the smells, are among the most clearly constructed by the brain rather than found in the world. The colour that you see is not a property of the light, which is merely electromagnetic radiation of a certain wavelength, but is a quality that the brain constructs and assigns. The experience of red being the brain's way of representing a certain range of wavelengths, the wavelength itself having no colour, the colour existing only in the experience that the brain constructs. There is nothing red about the light that we call red light. It is electromagnetic radiation with a wavelength of roughly 700 nanometers, a physical quantity that has no colour in itself, the redness being entirely the brain's construction, its way of representing this range of wavelengths in experience. A creature with a different visual system might represent the same wavelength entirely differently, or not distinguish it at all. The colour being not a property of the light, but a feature of the experience that a particular kind of visual system constructs from the light. The same is true of every colour, of the entire visual world of colour that seems so obviously to belong to the objects around you. The colours being constructed by the brain and projected onto the experience, the world in itself being colourless, possessing only the wavelengths of light that the brain represents through the experience of colour. The recognition was articulated in the scientific tradition through the distinction between the primary qualities, such as shape and size and motion, that were held to belong to the objects themselves, and the secondary qualities, such as colour and sound and taste, that were held to exist only in the perceiving mind, the distinction having been articulated influentially by the natural philosophers of the 17th century, including Galileo and Locke. Galileo argued, in a famous passage of his work The Essaya, published in 1623, that tastes, odours, colours, and the like exist only in the perceiving creature, and that if the perceiving creature were removed, these qualities would vanish. The world in itself, possessing only the shapes and motions of its particles, the sensory qualities being added by the perceiver. Galileo held that if ears, tongues, and noses were removed from the world, the shapes and numbers and motions of things would remain, but the tastes and sounds and odours would not, these existing only in the perceiving creature and being mere names apart from it, the world in itself being a world of particles in motion, without any of the sensory qualities that fill our experience of it. The philosopher John Locke writing later in the 17th century, developed the distinction systematically, holding that the primary qualities of shape, size, motion, and number genuinely belong to the objects and resemble our ideas of them, while the secondary qualities of color, sound, taste, and smell are powers in the objects to produce sensations in us that do not resemble anything in the objects themselves. The redness in our experience resembling nothing in the object that produces it. Locke's distinction established a framework in which a large part of the experienced world, the entire realm of the secondary qualities, is recognized as existing only in the perceiving mind. The world in itself, possessing only the primary qualities and the powers to produce the secondary qualities in perceivers, the rich sensory world being in this sense the mind's contribution rather than the world's possession. The recognition that the secondary qualities exist only in the perceiving mind, that the world in itself has no color or sound or taste, but only the physical properties that produce these experiences in the perceiver, establish that a vast portion of the experienced world is a construction of the mind rather than a property of the world, the rich sensory world being in large part the brain's construction. The contemporary neuroscience has confirmed and deepened this recognition, establishing in detail how the brain constructs the experience of color from the signals produced by the wavelengths of light, how it constructs the experience of sound from the signals produced by the pressure waves in the air, the sensory qualities being constructed by the brain rather than found in the world. The contemplative traditions recognize that the sensory qualities are in some sense constructed or projected, that the world as it appears to the senses is not the world as it is in itself, that the appearances conceal a reality that is other than they suggest. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the sensory qualities are constructed by the brain and the contemplative recognition that the sensory appearances are not the reality is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the neuroscience of perception, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the relationship between the sensory appearances and the reality, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the sensory appearances are not the reality, that the world as it appears to the senses conceals a reality that is other than the appearances suggest, runs through the contemplative traditions, which counseled the recognition that the world as it appears to the senses is not the world as it is in itself, that the sensory appearances are a kind of veil or projection rather than the direct disclosure of the reality, that the contemplative traditions recognize the sensory appearances as not the reality, and that the contemporary science has established that the sensory qualities are constructed by the brain rather than found in the world, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the appearances in the terms of the veil over the reality, and the science understands them in the terms of the brain's construction, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The recognition that perception is a construction raises the question of how much of the experienced world is contributed by the brain and how much by the signals from the world, and the contemporary science suggests that the contribution of the brain is far greater than common sense supposes. Common sense supposes that perception is mostly a matter of receiving the world, that the world delivers itself to the senses and the brain simply registers what is delivered, the contribution of the brain being minimal, a mere reception of what is given. The contemporary science overturns this supposition, establishing that the contribution of the brain is enormous, that the brain adds far more to the experienced world than the signals deliver, the experienced world being more the brain's construction than the world's delivery. The experienced world is not a faithful copy of the signals reaching the brain, but a construction that the brain builds, adding enormously to the signals, filling in the gaps, constructing the stable and detailed world of experience from signals that are fragmentary and ambiguous and constantly shifting. The brain fills in the blind spot where the optic nerve leaves the eye, constructing a seamless visual field where there is in fact a hole in the signals. At the point where the optic nerve exits the back of each eye, there are no light-sensitive cells, and so there is a region of the visual field from which no signal comes at all, a hole in the visual information, and yet you do not experience a hole, you experience a seamless and continuous visual field, the brain filling in the missing region with its best guess about what would be there, constructing the experience of a continuous field where the signals contain a gap. The brain constructs the stable visual world despite the constant movements of the eyes, which jump several times each second. The brain stitching together the fragmentary glimpses into the experience of a stable and continuous world. Your eyes do not glide smoothly across a scene but jump in rapid movements, called saccades, several times each second. The visual input being a series of brief fixations interrupted by these jumps, and yet you experience not a jerky series of glimpses, but a stable and continuous world. The brain constructing the stability from the fragmentary input, suppressing the experience of the jumps and stitching the glimpses into a seamless whole. The brain constructs the experience of a richly detailed visual field despite the fact that only the small central region of the visual field is seen in high resolution, the periphery being far less detailed than it seems. The brain constructing the experience of uniform detail from signals that are detailed only at the center. The contemplative traditions recognize that the experienced world is in large part the construction of the mind, that the mind contributes far more to the experienced world than is ordinarily recognized, that the appearances are the work of the mind as much as of the world. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the brain contributes enormously to the experienced world and the contemplative recognition that the mind contributes enormously to the appearances is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the contribution in the terms of the neuroscience, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the mind's construction of the appearances, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind contributes far more to the experienced world than common sense supposes, that the appearances are in large part the work of the mind, rather than the simple registration of a world that is given, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize the mind as an active power in the constitution of the experienced world, rather than a passive mirror. That the contemplative traditions recognize the mind's enormous contribution to the appearances, and that the contemporary science has established that the brain contributes enormously to the experienced world, filling in and constructing and stabilizing, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the contribution in the terms of the mind's construction of the appearances, and the science understands it in the terms of the neuroscience of perception, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The investigation that this opening has begun will be developed across the subsequent stages, which will examine more closely how the brain constructs the experienced world, the recognition that perception is the brain's best guess about the world, rather than a direct registration of it, and the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality. The recognition with which this stage began, the recognition that you have never once seen the world as it is, that everything you have ever experienced has been a construction your brain built inside the darkness of the skull, is a recognition that the contemporary science has established beyond serious doubt, and it is a recognition that forces the question of what the world is really like beneath the construction that the brain builds, and whether you have ever perceived it as it actually is. The contemplative traditions, examining the relationship between the appearances and the reality, arrived at the recognition that the world as it appears is not the world as it is, that the appearances conceal a reality that is other than they suggest, and they developed frameworks for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality that the subsequent stages of this investigation will examine. The next stage will examine the contemporary framework of perception as prediction, the recognition that the brain does not merely receive the signals and construct the world from them, but actively predicts the world and uses the signals to correct its predictions. The experienced world being the brain's prediction as much as its construction, a controlled hallucination that the signals from the world keep in check. The next stage will examine in particular the framework of predictive processing, the recognition that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, continuously generating predictions about the world and the signals it expects to receive, and using the actual signals not to build up the world from scratch, but to correct the predictions. The experienced world being the brain's best prediction rather than a construction assembled from the signals alone, a recognition that deepens the disturbance that this stage has opened. The subsequent stages will examine the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality, the Western frameworks of the cave and the thing in itself, the Eastern frameworks of Maya and the mind-constructed world, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The recognition that perception is not the passive reception of the world as it is, but the active construction of a model of the world, that you have never once perceived the world directly but only the model your brain constructs, that the rich world of colours and sounds and solid objects is in large part the brain's construction, is the recognition that opens the investigation into what the world is really like, and whether you have ever perceived it as it is. You have never once seen the world as it is, and the question of what the world is really like, beneath the construction that your brain builds, is the question that the investigation will examine. The world is there, a physical reality existing independently of you, and yet you have never directly perceived it, having known only the model your brain constructs, the controlled hallucination that your brain builds inside the darkness of the skull. What the world is like beneath the construction, whether it bears any resemblance to the world you experience, whether the colours and sounds and solid objects of your experience correspond to anything in the world as it is in itself, is the question that the recognition of perception as construction forces upon us, the question that the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions address in their different ways, the question that the investigation will continue to examine through the stages that follow. The investigation continues. The world you experience is not built up from what your senses deliver. It is a prediction, generated by your brain before the signals even arrive, and the signals serve only to correct the prediction where it goes wrong. The previous stage established that perception is a construction, that the experienced world is built by the brain rather than directly received, but it left in place the natural assumption that the construction is built up from the signals, that the brain takes the incoming signals and assembles the experience from them. This stage will overturn even that assumption, establishing that the construction is not built up from the signals but is generated by the brain as a prediction, the signals serving not as the raw material from which the experience is assembled, but as a check on a prediction that the brain has already generated. This is the most disturbing turn in the contemporary understanding of perception, and it reverses the ordinary picture of how perception works. The ordinary picture holds that the signals come in from the world, and the brain builds up the experience from them, the flow of information running from the world to the brain, the experience being constructed from the bottom up out of the incoming signals. The contemporary framework reverses this, holding that the brain generates the experience from the top down, predicting the world and the signals it expects to receive, and using the actual signals not to build up the experience from scratch, but to check and correct the prediction, the flow of information running primarily from the brain to the world, the prediction coming first, and the signals serving only to refine it. On this framework, the experienced world is the brain's prediction, its best guess about the causes of the signals it receives, a guess that is continuously generated and continuously corrected. The world you experience being the brain's hypothesis about the world, rather than a construction assembled from the signals. The signals do not deliver the world, they discipline the brain's guess about it. The the experienced world being the brain's hypothesis as disciplined by the signals, a guess held accountable to the world but generated by the brain. The contemporary science of perception has established this framework, known as predictive processing, through extensive research across recent decades, establishing that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, continuously generating predictions about the world and using the signals to correct them. The framework has roots in the recognition of the 19th century that perception involves inference, but it has been developed in recent decades into a detailed and mathematically precise account of how the brain works, supported by a growing body of evidence about the structure and the activity of the brain. The framework holds that the brain is organized as a hierarchy of predictions, with each level predicting the activity of the level below it, the higher levels predicting the more abstract features of the world, and the lower levels predicting the more concrete features, the predictions flowing down the hierarchy and the errors flowing up. The whole organized to generate an accurate model of the world by minimizing the prediction error at every level. At the lowest levels, the brain predicts the immediate sensory signals, the patterns of light and sound, while at the higher levels it predicts the more abstract features, the objects and the scenes and the causes that produce the signals, each level predicting the level below and being corrected by the errors that flow up from it, the whole hierarchy working together to generate a model of the world that minimizes the error at every level. This hierarchical organization allows the brain to model the world at every scale, from the immediate sensory signals to the abstract structure of the world that produces them, the model being generated from the top down and corrected from the bottom up, the experienced world being the brain's hierarchical model rather than a passive registration of the signals. The framework has been applied not only to perception but to action, to attention, to learning, and to the disorders of the mind, providing a unifying account of how the brain works that has become increasingly influential in the contemporary neuroscience. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the mind projects the world that it then experiences, that the experienced world is shaped by the mind's expectations and habits and constructions, that the mind encounters not the world as it is, but the world as the mind has shaped it. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that perception is prediction and the contemplative recognition that the mind projects the world it experiences is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the prediction in the terms of the neuroscience, while the contemplative traditions articulate the projection in the terms of the mind's shaping of the experienced world, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind does not simply receive the world, but projects the world that it then experiences, that the experienced world is shaped by the mind's own activity, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the mind encounters not a bare and unconditioned world, but a world already shaped by the mind's own habits and expectations and constructions. That the contemplative traditions recognize the mind as projecting the world it experiences, and that the contemporary science has established that perception is a process of prediction in which the brain generates the experienced world and corrects it by the signals, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the projection in the terms of the mind's shaping of the world, and the science understands it in the terms of the predictive brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, and it does not wait passively for the signals to arrive, but reaches out ahead of them, predicting what they will be. The recognition that the brain predicts rather than merely receives transforms the picture of the brain in its dark vault. The image from the previous stage was of a brain receiving signals and constructing the world from them, a prisoner building a picture of the outside from the taps on the walls of its cell. The predictive framework transforms this image, for the brain does not merely receive the taps and construct from them, but anticipates the taps, predicting what they will be before they arrive, generating its picture of the outside world and then using the taps only to correct the picture where the prediction fails. The prisoner does not wait for each tap and build up the picture from them, but has already generated a detailed picture of the outside world, a prediction, and listens for the taps only to find where the prediction needs adjusting, the picture being mostly the prisoner's own generation, with only the corrections coming from the taps. The brain is not a passive recipient, waiting for the signals to arrive and then constructing the world from them. It is an active predictor, continuously generating its best guess about the world and the signals it expects. The prediction running ahead of the signals, the brain anticipating the world rather than merely registering it. When the signals arrive, the brain compares them with its prediction, and where the prediction matches the signals, nothing more needs to happen, the prediction being confirmed. But where the prediction fails to match the signals, an error signal is generated, the mismatch between the prediction and the signals, and this error signal is used to correct the prediction, to update the brain's model of the world. This is a remarkable inversion of the ordinary picture, on which the signals carry the information and the brain receives it. On the predictive picture, the bulk of the information is already in the brain, in the prediction it has generated, and the signals carry only the correction, the error, the part of the prediction that needs adjusting, the signals being not the bearers of the world but the correctors of the brain's guess about the world. Most of what you experience on this picture comes from the brain rather than from the signals contributing only the corrections to a model that the brain has largely generated on its own, so that the experienced world is mostly the brain's prediction, with only the corrections coming from the world. This explains a great deal about perception that the older picture could not, including the extraordinary speed of perception, which would be difficult to achieve if the brain had to build up the experience from the signals each moment, but is readily achieved if the brain has already generated most of the experience as a prediction and needs only to correct. It explains the stability of perception, which would be difficult to achieve from the constantly shifting signals, but is readily achieved if the experience is mostly a stable prediction, corrected only at the edges. And it explains the way perception is shaped by expectation and context and prior experience, all of which feed into the prediction that the brain generates, the experience being shaped by everything that shapes the prediction, not only by the signals from the world. The experience world is the brain's prediction as corrected by the error signals, the brain's best current hypothesis about the world, continuously refined by the mismatch between what it predicts and what the signals indicate. The contemporary science has established that this predictive process operates throughout perception, that the brain is continuously predicting and correcting, that what you experience is the brain's prediction rather than the raw signals, the prediction being so continuously and accurately corrected that it usually matches the world well enough to be useful. The contemplative traditions recognize that the mind approaches the world with expectations and habits and constructions, that the mind does not encounter a bare world, but a world already shaped by the mind's anticipations, that the experienced world is in part the projection of the mind's own activity. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of the brain as a predictor and the contemplative recognition of the mind as approaching the world with its own constructions is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the prediction in the terms of the neuroscience, while the contemplative traditions articulate the mind's construction in the terms of its expectations and habits, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind does not approach the world empty and passive, but brings to it a whole structure of expectations and habits and constructions through which the world is encountered, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the mind shapes the world it perceives according to its own conditioning, finding in the world what its habits and expectations dispose it to find. That the contemplative traditions recognize the mind as bringing its own constructions to the world it perceives, and that the contemporary science has established the brain to be a predictor that brings its predictions to the signals it receives, is a striking relationship, Even as the traditions understood the mind's contribution in the terms of its conditioning, and the science understands it in the terms of prediction, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The framework of predictive processing has been developed most influentially by the neuroscientist Karl Friston, whose work at University College London articulated the mathematical framework that underlies the contemporary understanding of the predictive brain. Friston articulated the framework known as the free energy principle, the proposal that the brain, and indeed any self-organizing system that persists, acts so as to minimize a quantity that measures the mismatch between its predictions and the signals it receives, the brain continuously adjusting its predictions and its actions so as to minimize the prediction error, the surprise, the mismatch between what it expects and what it encounters. The framework proposes that any system that maintains itself against the tendency toward disorder must, in effect, model its environment and act so as to keep itself within the narrow range of states compatible with its continued existence, and that the minimization of prediction error is the mathematical expression of this imperative. The brain being the organ through which the human organism models its world and minimizes its surprise. The proposal is ambitious in its scope, applying not only to the brain but to any system that persists in the face of the tendency of all things toward disorder, the persistence of such a system requiring that it model its environment well enough to maintain itself, the minimization of prediction error being the condition of its continued existence. The brain, on this proposal, is the organ that performs this modeling for the human organism, generating the predictive model of the world that allows the organism to maintain itself, perception and action and learning, all being aspects of the modeling through which the organism minimizes its surprise and maintains itself in existence. The framework holds that the brain is fundamentally engaged in minimizing prediction error, that perception is the process of adjusting the predictions to match the signals, while action is the complementary process of adjusting the world to match the predictions, the two together serving to minimize the mismatch between the brain's model and the signals it receives. When the prediction does not match the signals, the brain can either change its prediction to match the signals, which is perception, or act upon the world to change the signals to match the prediction, which is action, the two being complementary strategies for reducing the mismatch, perception and action being unified as aspects of the single imperative to minimize prediction error. The framework provides a unified account of perception and action and learning, all understood as aspects of the single imperative to minimize prediction error, the brain continuously refining its model of the world so as to predict the signals it receives with ever greater accuracy. Learning on this framework is the long-term refinement of the brain's model so that it generates better predictions, the model being adjusted over time so that its predictions match the world more accurately. The brain learning the structure of the world by refining the predictions that minimize the error over the long run. Perception is the moment-to-moment adjustment of the predictions to match the current signals, and action is the adjustment of the world to match the predictions, and learning is the long-term refinement of the model that generates the predictions, all three being aspects of the single process of minimizing the mismatch between the brain's model and the signals it receives, the brain being, on this framework, fundamentally an organ for predicting the world and minimizing its surprise. The contemporary science has established that the brain operates according to these predictive principles, that perception is the process of generating and correcting predictions, that the experienced world is the brain's predictive model rather than a passive registration of the signals. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the mind continuously constructs and projects the world that it experiences, that the experienced world is the product of the mind's ongoing activity, that the mind shapes the world it encounters according to its own structures and habits. The relationship between the contemporary scientific framework of the predictive brain and the contemplative recognition of the mind's construction of the experienced world is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the prediction in the terms of the free energy principle, while the contemplative traditions articulate the construction in the terms of the mind's projection, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind continuously constructs the world that it experiences, that the experienced world is the ongoing product of the mind's activity rather than a fixed reality simply received, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize the experienced world as the continuous production of the mind, generated moment by moment according to the mind's structures, that the contemplative traditions recognize the experienced world as the mind's continuous construction, and that the contemporary science has established that the brain continuously generates its predictive model of the world, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the construction in the terms of the mind's projection, and the science understands it in the terms of the free energy principle, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The neuroscientist Anil Seth, whose work at the University of Sussex has examined the predictive nature of perception and consciousness, articulated the framework through the phrase that has come to capture its most striking implication: the recognition that perception is a controlled hallucination. Seth articulated the recognition that perception and hallucination are not fundamentally different processes, that in both cases the brain is generating a model of the world, the difference being only that in ordinary perception the model is controlled by the signals from the world, corrected and constrained by them, while in hallucination the model is generated without this control, the brain's predictions running free of the correction that the signals would provide. The recognition inverts the ordinary understanding of the relationship between perception and hallucination, on which perception is the normal contact with reality and hallucination is its breakdown, replacing it with the recognition that both are constructions of the brain, perception being a hallucination that is controlled by the world, while hallucination is a perception that has lost its control, the two lying on a continuum, rather than being fundamentally different in kind. On the ordinary understanding, perception puts us in direct contact with reality, while hallucination is a malfunction that severs this contact, the two being opposites, perception being contact and hallucination being its loss. On the inverted understanding, there is no direct contact with reality in either case, both being constructions of the brain, and the difference between them is only whether the construction is controlled by the signals from the world, perception being the controlled case and hallucination the uncontrolled, the two differing in degree of control rather than in kind, perception being not the opposite of hallucination, but a hallucination that happens to be controlled by the world. The recognition is that ordinary perception is itself a kind of hallucination, a model generated by the brain, differing from what we ordinarily call hallucination, only in that it is controlled by the signals from the world, the experienced world being a controlled hallucination, the brain's generated model kept in check by the signals. Seth articulated the further recognition that when we agree about our hallucinations, when the controlled hallucinations of different people align because they are controlled by the same world, we call it reality, reality being the name we give to the controlled hallucination that we share, the agreement among our hallucinations being what we take for the objectivity of the world. The objectivity of the world, on this view, is not the direct perception of the world as it is, which no one achieves, but the agreement among the controlled hallucinations of many perceivers, all controlled by the same world and therefore aligning, the shared hallucination being what we call the objective world. When everyone sees the tree in the same place, this is not because everyone directly perceives the tree as it is, but because everyone's controlled hallucination of the tree is constrained by the same signals from the same tree and therefore aligns, the agreement being what we take for the objectivity of the tree, the shared controlled hallucination being the only objectivity available to perceivers who never directly perceive the world. The contemporary science has established that perception is a generated model controlled by the signals, that the experienced world is the brain's controlled hallucination rather than a direct registration of the world. The contemplative traditions recognize that the experienced world is a kind of projection or construction of the mind, that the world as it appears is generated by the mind rather than simply found, that what we take for the solid reality is in some sense the mind's own production. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as controlled hallucination and the contemplative recognition of the experienced world as the mind's projection is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the hallucination in the terms of the predictive brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate the projection in the terms of the mind's construction of the world, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that what we take for the solid and independent reality is in some sense the mind's own production, generated by the mind rather than simply found, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the world as it appears is in part the projection of the mind, the solidity and the independence of the world being themselves features of the mind's construction. That the contemplative traditions recognize the experienced world as the mind's projection, and that the contemporary science has established perception to be a controlled hallucination generated by the brain and kept in check by the signals, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the projection in the terms of the mind's construction, and the science understands it in the terms of the controlled hallucination, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The recognition that perception is prediction has a disturbing implication, that what you perceive is shaped as much by your expectations as by the world, so that you tend to perceive what you expect to perceive, the prediction shaping the experience. The contemporary science has established that expectation profoundly shapes perception, that the same signals can produce different experiences depending on what the brain predicts, that the brain's predictions can cause it to perceive what is not there and to fail to perceive what is there, the experience being shaped by the prediction as much as by the signals. The familiar experiences of seeing a face in a random pattern, of hearing words in meaningless noise once you expect them, of failing to notice what you do not expect, are manifestations of the predictive nature of perception, the brain perceiving according to its predictions, finding in the signals what it expects to find. You see faces in clouds and in the patterns of wood grain and in the fronts of cars because the brain, primed to detect faces, predicts faces and finds them in patterns that merely resemble them, the prediction shaping the experience. The face is not in the cloud, but the brain, predicting faces, perceives one there, the experience of the face being generated by the prediction and projected onto the pattern that merely resembles a face. You hear meaningful words in the ambiguous sounds of a recording once you have been told what to listen for. The same sounds being heard as meaningless before the expectation and as meaningful after it, the expectation reshaping the perception. You fail to notice the unexpected thing in plain sight. The famous experiments on inattentional blindness, having demonstrated that observers absorbed in one task can fail entirely to perceive a striking and unexpected event before their eyes, the brain not predicting it and therefore not perceiving it. These are not failures of an otherwise accurate perception, but manifestations of the predictive nature of all perception. The ordinary accuracy of perception being itself the product of predictions that usually match the world. The cases where the prediction shapes the experience against the signals, revealing the predictive nature of perception that operates always, even when it goes unnoticed. The recognition bears on the question of what the world is really like, since if you perceive what you expect as much as what is there, then your perception of the world is shaped by your own predictions, the world you experience being in part a projection of your expectations onto the signals, the prediction filling in and shaping the experience according to what the brain anticipates. This adds a further layer to the disturbance, for it means not only that you have never directly perceived the world, having known only the brain's construction, but that the construction is shaped by your own expectations, so that you tend to perceive a world that conforms to what you expect, the prediction shaping the experience toward your anticipations, the world you experience being shaped by your own mind's predictions as much as by the world itself. The contemplative traditions recognize that the mind perceives the world through the filter of its own habits and expectations and constructions, that the mind tends to find in the world what it expects and projects, that the experienced world is shaped by the mind's own patterns as much as by the world itself. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that perception is shaped by expectation and the contemplative recognition that the mind perceives through the filter of its own constructions is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the shaping in the terms of the predictive brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the mind's habits and projections, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind perceives the world through the filter of its own habits and expectations, tending to find in the world what it expects and projects, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the mind's conditioning shapes its perception, that the world is seen through the lens of the mind's own patterns rather than encountered bare, that the contemplative traditions recognize the mind as perceiving through the filter of its own constructions, and that the contemporary science has established that perception is shaped by the brain's expectations as much as by the signals, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the filtering in the terms of the mind's conditioning and the science understands it in the terms of the predictive shaping of perception, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages with the examination of what happens when the prediction goes wrong, the recognition that the predictive nature of perception makes it vulnerable to systematic error, and the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality. The next stage will examine what happens when the brain's prediction goes wrong, the recognition that the same predictive machinery that constructs the ordinary experienced world can construct experiences that depart from the world in the phantom limb and the placebo and the nocebo and the illusion and the delusion, the failures of prediction revealing the predictive nature of ordinary perception. The next stage will examine in particular the cases where the prediction departs from the world, where the brain perceives what is not there or fails to perceive what is, where the predictive machinery that usually keeps the experienced world in accurate contact with the world produces experiences that depart from it, the failures revealing the predictive nature of perception that operates always, and revealing the fragility of the contact between the experienced world and the world as it is. The subsequent stages will examine the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality. The Western frameworks of the cave and the thing in itself, the Eastern frameworks of Maya and the mind-constructed world, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The recognition that perception is not the construction of the world from the signals but the generation of a prediction that the signals correct, that the experienced world is the brain's controlled hallucination, its best guess about the causes of the signals, kept in check by the signals but generated by the brain, is the recognition that this stage has explored. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, generating its best guess about the world and correcting it by the signals, and the question of how often the guess is right and what the world is like beneath the guess is the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The guess is usually right enough to be useful, corrected continuously by the signals so that it keeps the experienced world in workable contact with the world as it is. But the guess is a guess, and a guess can be wrong, and the next stage will examine what happens when it is, the cases where the predictive machinery produces an experienced world that departs from the world as it is, revealing both the predictive nature of all perception and the fragility of the contact between the experienced world and the reality. What the world is like beneath the guess, whether the brain's best guess bears any resemblance to the world as it is in itself, is the question that the recognition of perception as prediction leaves open, the question that the contemplative traditions address through their frameworks of the appearances and the reality, the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The investigation continues. The same machinery that builds the world you trust can build a world that is not there. The previous stages establish that perception is a construction, a prediction generated by the brain and corrected by the signals, a controlled hallucination that usually matches the world well enough to be useful. The word usually carried the whole weight of the contact between the experienced world and the world as it is. The experienced world being usually accurate, the prediction usually matching the world, the controlled hallucination usually controlled well enough to be useful. But the qualification that the prediction usually matches the world conceals a disturbing recognition that the prediction does not always match the world, that the same predictive machinery that constructs the ordinary trustworthy world can construct experiences that depart from the world, perceiving what is not there and failing to perceive what is, generating a world that the signals do not support. And the most disturbing feature of these failures is that, from the inside, they are indistinguishable from accurate perception, the faulty guess being experienced with the same conviction and immediacy as the accurate one, so that you cannot tell, from within the experience, whether your perception is accurate or has gone wrong, the experience carrying the same conviction in either case. This stage will examine the failures of the predictive machinery, the cases where the guess goes wrong, where the brain perceives a limb that has been amputated, where the brain produces real effects from expectation alone, where the brain is deceived by illusions that reveal the assumptions built into perception, where the brain constructs a world that departs profoundly from the world in delusion. Each of these failures is a case where the brain constructs an experience that the world does not support, the prediction departing from the signals or running ahead of them, or ignoring them, the experienced world departing from the world as it is, and each of these failures, far from being a mere malfunction to be set aside, reveals the constructive and predictive nature of the perception that operates always, the failures making visible the construction that the ordinary smooth functioning of perception conceals. These failures are not merely curiosities but are revealing, since they expose the predictive machinery that operates in all perception. The failures revealing the construction that ordinary perception conceals, the cases where the guess goes wrong revealing that all perception is a guess. When perception functions smoothly, the construction is invisible, the experienced world seeming simply to be the world, the brain's guess seeming simply to be the direct perception of reality. It is in the failures, where the guess departs from the world in ways that can be detected, that the construction becomes visible, the failures revealing that what seemed the direct perception of reality was all along a construction, a guess, that happened in the ordinary case to be accurate. The contemporary science of perception has established that perception is vulnerable to systematic error, that the predictive machinery can be deceived and can deceive itself, that the experienced world can depart from the world in ways that reveal the constructed nature of all perception. The contemplative traditions arrived at their own recognition that the mind can be profoundly deceived about the nature of the world, that the appearances can mislead, that the ordinary perception of the world is itself a kind of error or illusion that conceals the reality. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that perception is vulnerable to systematic error and the contemplative recognition that the mind is deceived by the appearances is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the error in the terms of the predictive brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate the deception in the terms of the mind's illusion about the reality, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind can be deceived about the nature of the world, that the appearances can mislead, and that the ordinary perception of the world can itself be a kind of error, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the mind is liable to a deep deception about the reality. taking the appearances for the reality and thereby missing the truth. That the contemplative traditions recognize the mind as liable to deception about the reality, and that the contemporary science has established that perception is vulnerable to systematic error, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the deception in the terms of the mind's error about the reality, and the science understands it in the terms of the predictive brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, and when its guess goes wrong, it cannot tell, experiencing the faulty guess with the same conviction as the accurate one. This is the most disturbing feature of the failures of perception, that they cannot be detected from within the experience, that the brain has no way of knowing, from the experience alone, whether its guess is accurate or has gone wrong, the faulty guess being experienced with exactly the same vividness and conviction as the accurate one. The person who feels the phantom limb feels it as vividly as a real limb. The person who experiences the placebo effect experiences real benefit. The person who sees the illusion sees it as clearly as anything real, even knowing it to be an illusion. The brain in its dark vault constructs its best guess and experiences it as the world, with no independent access to the world against which to check the guess, no way of stepping outside the experience to compare it with the reality, so that the accurate guess and the faulty guess are, from within the experience, indistinguishable, both being experienced simply as the world. The phantom limb is among the most striking demonstrations of the constructive nature of perception. The experience of a limb that is no longer there, felt vividly by a person whose limb has been amputated, the brain continuing to construct the experience of the limb despite the absence of the limb itself. A person whose arm has been amputated may continue to feel the arm vividly, may feel it in a particular position, may feel it move, may feel sensations, and even pain in fingers that no longer exist. The experience of the limb persisting despite the limb being gone, the brain continuing to generate the experience from its model of the body. This is among the clearest demonstrations that the experience of the body is not a direct registration of the body, but a construction the brain generates. Since the experience persists where the body is absent, the brain constructing the vivid experience of a limb that is no longer there, the experience being generated by the model rather than by the limb. The phenomenon was studied in detail by the neuroscientist Vilayanur Ramachandran, whose work at the University of California, San Diego, he examined the phantom limb and developed treatments for the pain that often accompanies it. Ramachandran developed the famous mirror box treatment, in which a mirror is arranged so that the reflection of the intact limb appears in the place of the missing limb, allowing the brain to see the phantom limb move when the intact limb moves. The visual feedback relieving the phantom pain by allowing the brain to update its model of the body. The relief through a mirror, demonstrating that the phantom is a construction that can be altered by changing the signals that feed the model. The phantom is often felt vividly, the person feeling its position, feeling it move, feeling pain in it, the experience being as vivid as that of a real limb despite there being no limb there at all. The phantom limb demonstrates that the experience of the body is a construction of the brain rather than a direct registration of the body. The brain maintaining a model of the body that can persist even when the body is changed. The experience of the limb being generated by the brain's model rather than by signals from the limb that no longer exists. The brain's model of the body image, is constructed and maintained by the brain, and it can diverge from the actual body, the phantom limb being the experience of the body image where the actual body is absent, the brain constructing the vivid experience of a limb from its model alone. The contemporary science has established that the experience of the body is a construction of the brain, that the brain maintains a model of the body that generates the experience, that this model can diverge from the actual body, the phantom limb being the experience generated by the model where the body is absent. The contemplative traditions recognize that the experience of the body and the self can be a construction that diverges from the reality, that the ordinary identification with the body is a kind of construction that the contemplative examination can reveal and loosen. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the experience of the body is a construction that can diverge from the actual body, and the contemplative recognition that the identification with the body is a construction is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the body image, while the contemplative traditions articulate it in the terms of the identification with the body. And any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the ordinary identification with the body is a construction that can be examined and loosened, that the experience of the body and the self is not a simple given, but a construction of the mind, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize that the identification with the body is a kind of construction rather than a simple fact, and which develop practices for examining and loosening it, that the contemplative traditions recognize the identification with the body as a construction, and that the contemporary science has established that the experience of the body is a construction that can diverge from the actual body, is a striking relationship, even as the traditions understood the construction in the terms of the identification with the body, and the science understands it in the terms of the body image. And the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The placebo and the nocebo demonstrate that the brain's predictions can produce real effects on the body, that the expectation of healing or of harm can produce the corresponding effect, the prediction shaping not only the experience, but the physical state of the body. These phenomena extend the recognition of the predictive nature of perception beyond the experienced world to the body itself, demonstrating that the brain's predictions reach into the physical state of the body, that the expectation of a bodily state can help to bring that state about, the predictive machinery shaping not only what is experienced but what physically happens in the body. The placebo effect, the production of real therapeutic benefit by an inert treatment that the person believes to be effective, has been established through extensive research, demonstrating that the expectation of benefit can produce real changes in the body, the release of the body's own pain-relieving substances, the alteration of the physical state, the prediction of healing, producing real healing. The research has established that placebo effects are not merely imagined or reported, but involve real physiological changes, the expectation of pain relief, producing the release of the body's own opioids, the expectation of improvement, producing measurable changes in the relevant physiological systems, the prediction of benefit, setting in motion the bodily processes that produce the benefit. The placebo effect demonstrates with particular clarity that the brain's predictions reach into the body, that the expectation of a bodily state can produce that state, the prediction of healing, producing the physiological changes of healing, the body responding to the brain's prediction as it would to the reality. The nocebo effect, the complementary phenomenon in which the expectation of harm produces real harm, demonstrates that the prediction of suffering can produce real suffering, the expectation of a side effect producing the side effect, the prediction of harm producing real harm. The nocebo effect is the darker complement of the placebo, the expectation of harm producing real harm just as the expectation of benefit produces real benefit, the person who expects a treatment to cause a side effect often experiencing that side effect. The prediction of harm, setting in motion the bodily processes that produce it. The phenomena demonstrate that the brain's predictions are not confined to the experience but extend to the body. That the prediction of a state of the body can produce that state, the predictive machinery shaping not only the experienced world but the physical body itself. The contemporary science has established that expectation can produce real physical effects, that the brain's predictions shape the body as well as the experience, that the prediction of a bodily state can bring that state about. The contemplative traditions recognize that the mind shapes the body and the experience, that the states of the mind have real effects on the body, that the mind's expectations and beliefs are not without effect on the physical state of the person. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the brain's predictions produce real physical effects and the contemplative recognition that the mind shapes the body is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the effects in the terms of the placebo and nocebo, while the contemplative traditions articulate the mind's influence in the terms of the relationship between the mind and the body, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind shapes the body, that the states of the mind have real effects on the physical state of the person, that the mind's expectations and beliefs are not without bodily consequence, runs through the contemplative traditions, which recognize the deep connection between the mind and the body, the influence of the states of the mind on the states of the body, that the contemplative traditions recognize the mind's influence on the body, and that the contemporary science has established that the brain's predictions produce real physical effects through the placebo and the nocebo, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the influence in the terms of the relationship between the mind and the body, and the science understands it in the terms of the predictive brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The illusions of perception reveal the assumptions built into the predictive machinery, the cases where the brain's predictions produce a systematic error that exposes the assumptions on which the predictions rest. The illusions are valuable precisely because they fail in systematic and reproducible ways. The systematic failure exposing the assumption that produces it, the illusion being a window onto the assumptions that the brain brings to perception, the assumptions that usually operate invisibly to produce accurate perception, but that produce a visible and reproducible error. In the special case, the illusion arranges. By studying when and how perception goes systematically wrong, the science can work out the assumptions that the brain brings to perception, the assumptions that the illusions expose by exploiting them, each illusion revealing some assumption that the brain makes about the world, some prior expectation built into the predictive machinery. The visual illusions, in which lines of equal length appear unequal, in which stationary patterns appear to move, in which the same color appears different in different contexts, reveal that the brain does not register the signals directly, but interprets them according to assumptions about the world. Assumptions that usually produce accurate perception, but that produce systematic error in the special cases that the illusions exploit. The illusion in which two lines of equal length appear unequal, the one with the outward pointing fins appearing longer than the one with the inward pointing fins, reveals an assumption the brain makes about depth and size, an assumption that usually produces accurate perception of the three-dimensional world, but that produces systematic error when applied to the flat lines of the illusion. The illusion in which the same grey patch appears light against a dark background and dark against a light background reveals that the brain perceives not the absolute amount of light, but the light relative to the surroundings, an assumption that usually produces accurate perception of surfaces under varying illumination, but that produces systematic error. In the special case, the illusion arranges. The illusions are not failures of an otherwise direct perception, but revelations of the assumptions on which all perception rests. The systematic errors exposing the assumptions that usually operate invisibly to produce the accurate perception of the ordinary world. The illusion persists even when you know it is an illusion, the knowledge that the lines are equal, failing to make them appear equal, the perception being produced by the predictive machinery that operates below the level of conscious knowledge, the prediction continuing to produce the illusory experience even when you know it to be false. This is among the most revealing features of the illusions, that they persist against knowledge, that knowing the lines to be equal does not make them appear equal, the perception being generated by machinery that operates below and independently of conscious knowledge, so that the illusory experience continues to be produced even when the conscious mind knows it to be false, demonstrating that the construction of perception is not under the control of conscious knowledge, but is performed by machinery that operates automatically and below awareness. The rubber hand illusion, in which a person comes to feel that a rubber hand is their own when it is stroked in synchrony with their hidden real hand, demonstrates that even the sense of which body is yours is a construction that can be manipulated, the brain incorporating the rubber hand into its body image when the signals are arranged to suggest it. The experiment, developed by the researchers Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen and published in 1998, arranges for a person to watch a rubber hand being stroked while their own hidden hand is stroked in synchrony, and after a time, the person comes to feel the touch in the rubber hand and to feel the rubber hand as their own, the brain incorporating the false hand into its model of the body on the basis of the synchronized signals, the sense of bodily ownership being revealed as a construction that the brain produces, and that can be manipulated by manipulating the signals. The effect can be strong enough that when the rubber hand is threatened, the person flinches as if their own hand were threatened, the brain having so thoroughly incorporated the rubber hand into its body image that it responds to a threat to the rubber hand as a threat to the body, the sense of which body is yours being revealed as a construction that the brain builds from the signals, and that can be redirected onto a false hand when the signals are arranged to suggest it. The illusion demonstrates that even the most basic sense of bodily ownership, the sense that this hand is mine, is not a simple given but a construction that the brain assembles from the available signals, a construction that can be manipulated and even captured by a false hand when the signals are arranged appropriately. The contemporary science has established that perception rests on assumptions that the illusions reveal, that the brain interprets the signals according to built-in expectations, that the systematic errors of the illusions expose the constructive nature of all perception. The contemplative traditions recognize that the ordinary perception of the world rests on assumptions and constructions that the contemplative examination can reveal, that the world as it ordinarily appears is shaped by the mind's assumptions, that the examination of perception can expose the constructions that ordinarily go unnoticed. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that perception rests on assumptions that the illusions reveal and the contemplative recognition that ordinary perception rests on constructions that examination can expose is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the assumptions in the terms of the predictive brain, while the contemplative traditions articulate the constructions in the terms of the mind's assumptions, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that ordinary perception rests on assumptions and constructions that usually go unnoticed, but that careful examination can expose, that the world as it ordinarily appears is shaped by assumptions the mind brings to it, runs through the contemplative traditions, which develop practices of examination through which the constructions underlying ordinary perception could be brought to light. That the contemplative traditions recognized ordinary perception as resting on constructions that examination can expose, and that the contemporary science has established that perception rests on assumptions that the illusions reveal is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the constructions in the terms of the mind's assumptions and the science understands them in the terms of the predictive brain, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The delusion represents the most profound failure of the predictive machinery, the case where the brain constructs a model of the world that departs systematically and persistently from the world, the prediction running so far from the signals that the experienced world becomes profoundly false, where the illusion is a momentary and local error corrected as soon as the conditions change. The more profound disorders of perception and belief involve a systematic and persistent departure of the experienced world from the world, the predictive machinery, producing a model that diverges from the world in a sustained way, rather than in the momentary way of an illusion. These are sensitive matters, and they are raised here not to characterize any person but to illuminate the predictive nature of all perception, the disorders revealing, in their departures from the ordinary, the constructive machinery that operates in all perception, ordinary and disordered alike. The contemporary science has examined the disorders of perception and belief in which the predictive machinery malfunctions, in which the balance between the predictions and the signals is disturbed, the predictions running free of the correction that the signals should provide, or the signals being given weight where they should be discounted. The result being an experienced world that departs from the world. The framework of predictive processing has been applied to the understanding of these disorders, the proposal being that they involve a disturbance in the balance between the predictions and the error signals, the predictions and the signals being weighted incorrectly, so that the brain constructs a world that the signals do not support, or fails to construct the world that the signals indicate. On this proposal, the brain must continuously balance its predictions against the error signals, giving the predictions enough weight that the experienced world is stable and coherent, but giving the signals enough weight that the predictions are corrected where they are wrong, and a disturbance in this balance can produce the departures from reality of the disorders, the predictions being given too much weight so that they are not corrected by the signals, or the signals being given too much weight so that they are not integrated into a coherent model, the result in either case being an experienced world that departs from the world as it is. The hallucination on this proposal is a prediction that has been given too much weight, running free of the correction that the signals should provide, the brain perceiving what it predicts rather than what the signals indicate, while the delusion is a belief that has been adopted to make sense of experiences that the disturbed machinery has produced. The disturbance reaching from the perception into the structure of belief, the recognition that the same predictive machinery that produces ordinary perception can, when its balance is disturbed, produce the profound departures from reality of the delusion, and the hallucination reveals that ordinary perception and its disorders lie on a continuum, the disorders being not the intrusion of something foreign, but the malfunction of the same machinery that produces ordinary perception. This recognition has a humbling implication, that the boundary between the ordinary perception we trust and the disordered perception we recognize as departing from reality is not a sharp line between contact with reality and its loss, but a matter of how well the same predictive machinery is functioning, ordinary perception being not the direct contact with reality that it seems, but the well-functioning case of the same construction that, when it functions less well, produces the departures we recognize as disordered. The contemplative traditions recognize that the mind can be profoundly deceived about the nature of the world, that the ordinary perception of the world is itself a kind of deep error from the contemplative point of view, that the mind's construction of the world can depart profoundly from the reality. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that the predictive machinery can produce profound departures from reality and the contemplative recognition that the mind can be profoundly deceived about the world is striking. Even as the contemporary science articulates the departure in the terms of the disturbed predictive machinery, while the contemplative traditions articulate the deception in the terms of the mind's error about the reality, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the mind can be profoundly deceived about the nature of the world, that the ordinary perception of the world is itself, from the contemplative point of view, a kind of deep error that conceals the reality, runs through the contemplative traditions, which held that the ordinary perception of the world, taken to be the direct contact with reality, is itself a kind of deep deception that the contemplative path aims to dispel, that the contemplative traditions recognize the mind as capable of profound deception about the world, and that the contemporary science has established that the predictive machinery can produce profound departures from reality, is a striking relationship. Even as the traditions understood the deception in the terms of the mind's error about the reality, and the science understands it in the terms of the disturbed predictive machinery, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages, with the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions of the West and the East have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The next stage will examine the frameworks that the great traditions of the West have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality, the framework of the cave in which the prisoners take the shadows for the reality, the framework of the thing in itself that lies beyond the appearances, the frameworks that located the reality beyond the appearances that the mind constructs. The next stage will examine in particular how the Western philosophical tradition, confronting the gap between the appearances and the reality, developed frameworks for understanding the appearances as a kind of veil or construction that conceals a reality beyond them, the framework of the cave in which the prisoners mistake the shadows for the real things, the framework of the thing in itself that lies forever beyond the appearances that the mind constructs, frameworks that bear in striking ways on the contemporary recognition that the experienced world is the brain's construction. The subsequent stages will examine the frameworks that the great traditions of the East have developed, the framework of Maya in which the world, as it appears, is a kind of appearance that conceals the deeper reality, the framework of the mind-constructed world, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The recognition that the same predictive machinery that constructs the ordinary trustworthy world can construct experiences that depart from the world, that the brain cannot tell when its guess goes wrong, experiencing the faulty guess with the same conviction as the accurate one, that the failures of perception reveal the constructive nature of all perception, is the recognition that this stage has explored. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, constructing a world that it cannot directly check against the reality, and the question of how you could ever know whether your guess is right, whether the world you experience corresponds to the world as it is the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The brain has no independent access to the world against which to check its guess, no way of stepping outside the experience to compare the model with the reality, so that the question of whether the experienced world corresponds to the world as it is becomes a question that cannot be answered from within the experience being all the brain has, the world as it is lying, always beyond the experience that represents it. How you could ever know whether your perception is accurate, whether the world you experience resembles the world as it is, given that you have access only to the experience and never to the world directly, is the question that the recognition of perception as a fallible construction forces upon us. The question that the contemplative traditions address through their frameworks of the appearances and the reality, the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The investigation continues. For more than 2,000 years, the West has insisted that the world you see is not the real world. Long before the contemporary neuroscience established that perception is a construction of the brain, the great philosophical and religious traditions of the West had already arrived at the recognition that the world, as it appears to the senses, is not the world as it truly is, that the appearances are a kind of veil or shadow or construction that conceals a deeper reality, that the wise must look beyond the appearances to the reality they conceal. The previous stages established, through the contemporary science, that the experienced world is a construction of the brain, that you have never directly perceived the world, but only the model your brain builds, that this model is a prediction that can go wrong, and that you cannot check against the reality from within the experience. The traditions of the West arrived at a recognition that resonates with this, though by an entirely different route, the recognition that the world, as it appears, is not the world as it is, that the appearances conceal rather than reveal the reality, that the wise must look beyond what the senses present to the reality that lies behind it. The traditions of the West did not arrive at this recognition through the study of the brain, which they did not have, but but through philosophical reflection on the relationship between the appearances and the reality. Through the recognition that the senses can deceive, that the world as it appears is shaped by the perceiver, that the reality is other than it seems, they observed that the senses sometimes deceive, that the stick appears bent in water though it is straight, that the distant tower appears round though it is square, that the same water feels warm to one hand and cold to the other, and they reasoned from these everyday deceptions of the senses to the more radical possibility that the senses might deceive us about the nature of reality altogether, that the world as it appears to the senses might be systematically other than the world as it is. From this reflection they arrived at frameworks for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality, frameworks that located the reality beyond the appearances and that counseled the wise to look beyond what the senses present to the reality they conceal. This stage will examine the frameworks that the great traditions of the West developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality, the framework of the cave in which the prisoners take the shadows for the reality, the framework of the thing in itself that lies forever beyond the appearances, the framework of the dim and partial vision that awaits a clearer seeing. The contemporary science establishes that the experienced world is a construction of the brain, a model that the brain builds and that stands between the perceiver and the world, even as the contemporary science holds that there is a real world beyond the construction that the construction represents. The Western traditions arrived at the recognition that the appearances are not the reality, that the world as it seems is not the world as it is, and the relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as construction and the traditional recognition that the appearances are not the reality is striking, even as the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the neuroscience, while the traditions articulate the relationship between appearance and reality in the terms of their various frameworks, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. A genuine difference must be noted here, that the investigation should not obscure, for the traditions differed among themselves and from the science about what lies beyond the appearances. The Platonic tradition locating the reality in eternal forms apprehended by the intellect, the Kantian framework holding the reality in itself to be forever unknowable, the Christian framework locating a fuller vision in a future transformation, the contemporary science locating the reality in the physical world that the construction represents, and that the methods of science can investigate. These are different claims about what lies beyond the appearances, and they should not be assimilated to one another. The agreement that the appearances are not the whole reality, concealing real differences about what the reality beyond the appearances is. The contemporary science establishes that the experienced world is a construction of the brain, a model that the brain builds and that stands between the perceiver and the world, even as the contemporary science holds that there is a real world beyond the construction that the construction represents, and that the methods of science can investigate, however indirectly. The Greek philosophical tradition provided the most influential of the Western frameworks for the relationship between the appearances and the reality. The allegory of the cave articulated by the philosopher Plato in the 4th century before the Common Era. The allegory is perhaps the most famous image in the history of Western philosophy, and it has shaped the Western understanding of the relationship between the appearances and the reality for more than 2,000 years, providing the enduring image of the human condition as one of imprisonment among appearances that are mistaken for the reality. The power of the allegory lies in its vivid depiction of a condition that the prisoners cannot recognize from within. The prisoners taking the shadows for the reality precisely because they have never known anything else, the appearances being all they have ever experienced and therefore being taken without question for the reality itself, the very completeness of their imprisonment among the appearances preventing them from recognizing it as imprisonment. Plato presented the allegory in the dialogue The Republic, describing prisoners who have been chained since childhood in a cave, able to see only the wall before them. on which are cast the shadows of objects carried behind them before a fire, the prisoners taking the shadows for the whole of reality, never having seen the objects that cast them, nor the fire that cast them, nor the world outside the cave. The prisoners, having been chained since childhood with their heads fixed so that they can see only the wall before them, have never seen anything but the shadows, and so they naturally take the shadows to be the real things, giving names to the shadows, predicting their movements, taking the shadow world to be the whole of reality, having no conception of the objects that cast the shadows or the fire behind them, or the vast world outside the cave, the shadow world being the only world they have ever known. The allegory describes the condition of the prisoners who take the shadows for the reality, who have never seen anything but the shadows and therefore take the shadows to be the real things, and it describes the difficult ascent of one who is freed from the chains and turns to see the objects and the fire, and finally emerges from the cave into the sunlit world outside, the world of the real things of which the shadows in the cave were only the faint and distorted images. The freed prisoner, turning for the first time toward the fire, is at first dazzled and pained, the eyes accustomed to the shadows being unable at first to bear the brighter light, and the ascent out of the cave into the sunlight is described as difficult and disorienting, the eyes needing time to adjust to the brightness of the real world. The prisoner at first unable to look at the things themselves and able only gradually to come to see them. The ascent from the world of appearances to the world of realities being arduous and requiring a painful adjustment. The allegory articulated the recognition that the world as it appears to us may be like the shadows on the wall of the cave, a faint and distorted image of a reality that we have never directly seen, the philosopher being the one who turns from the shadows to seek the reality that casts them, who ascends from the world of appearances to the world of the realities that the appearances dimly image. The contemporary science has established that the experience world is a construction, a kind of image that the brain builds, that stands between the perceiver and the reality, the experience world being in this respect, like the shadows on the wall of the cave, an image that the perceiver takes for the reality. The perceiver, like the prisoner, has known nothing but the constructed world, the brain's model, and so takes it without question for the reality itself, having no conception of the reality beyond the construction being the only world the perceiver has ever directly known, taken for the reality precisely because it is all that has ever been experienced. The resemblance to the condition of the prisoners is striking, the perceiver living within the brain's construction as the prisoners live within the world of shadows, both taking the image for the reality because the image is all they have ever known. The relationship between the Platonic allegory of the cave and the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as construction is striking, even as the Platonic allegory articulates the appearances in the terms of the shadows that image the eternal forms, while the contemporary science articulates the construction in the terms of the brain's model of the physical world, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science or the philosophy themselves establish. The resemblance is striking, the prisoners taking the shadows for the reality resembling the perceiver who takes the brain's construction for the world, both mistaking an image for the reality it images, both living within a world of appearances that they take for the reality itself. But the difference must also be noted, for the Platonic cave locates the reality in the eternal forms that the intellect apprehends, a reality beyond the physical world altogether, while the contemporary science locates the reality in the physical world that the brain's construction represents, the two frameworks agreeing that the appearances are not the reality, but differing about what the reality is, the Platonic reality being the eternal forms and the scientific reality being the physical world, that the Platonic allegory and the contemporary science both recognize the experienced world as an image, that the perceiver mistakes for the reality is a striking relationship, even as they differ about what the reality beyond the image is, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The Platonic framework located the reality beyond the appearances in the eternal and unchanging forms, the perfect realities of which the changing things of the sensible world are only the imperfect images, the forms being apprehended not by the senses but by the intellect. For Plato, the cave allegory was not merely an image of the deceptiveness of the senses but part of a comprehensive framework in which the deepest reality consists of the eternal forms, the perfect and unchanging realities that the intellect can apprehend, and of which the changing things of the sensible world are imperfect copies, the whole sensible world being a realm of becoming and change that images the eternal realm of being. The framework held that the things of the sensible world, the things we perceive through the senses, are imperfect and changing copies of the eternal and perfect forms, the many beautiful things being imperfect copies of the one form of beauty itself, the many equal things being imperfect copies of the form of equality itself, the sensible world being a world of imperfect copies that image the perfect forms. The framework held that the forms are apprehended not by the senses, which perceive only the imperfect copies, but by the intellect, which can rise above the sensible appearances to apprehend the eternal forms that they image. The philosopher ascending from the sensible appearances to the intelligible reality of the forms. The framework held that the forms are apprehended not by the senses, which perceive only the imperfect copies, but by the intellect, which can rise above the sensible appearances to apprehend the eternal forms that they image. The philosopher ascending from the sensible appearances to the intelligible reality of the forms. The framework located the deepest reality not in the world that the senses perceive, but in the eternal forms that the intellect apprehends, the sensible world being a derivative and imperfect reality that images the forms, the appearances being a veil that the philosopher must penetrate to reach the reality. The contemporary science has established that the experienced world is a construction that stands between the perceiver and the reality. Even as the contemporary science locates the reality not in eternal forms beyond the physical world, but in the physical world itself, which the construction represents. The difference here is significant, for the Platonic framework located the reality in a realm of eternal forms beyond the physical world altogether, apprehended by the intellect rather than the senses, while the contemporary science locates the reality in the physical world itself, the world of matter and energy that the brain's construction represents, a reality that is investigated not by the intellect rising above the senses, but by the methods of science that extend and discipline the senses. The two frameworks agree that the reality lies beyond the appearances but differ about where the reality is to be found, the Platonic reality being a transcendent realm of forms and the scientific reality being the physical world itself. The relationship between the Platonic framework of the forms beyond the appearances and the contemporary scientific recognition of a reality beyond the construction is striking, even as the Platonic framework locates the reality in the eternal forms while the contemporary science locates it in the physical world, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science or the philosophy themselves establish. The two frameworks agree that there is a reality beyond the appearances, that the world the senses present is not the deepest reality, that the deepest reality lies beyond what the senses directly present. But they differ profoundly about what this reality is, the Platonic framework locating it in the eternal and unchanging forms apprehended by the intellect, a reality of perfect and timeless realities beyond the changing physical world, while the contemporary science locates it in the physical world itself, the world of matter and energy that the brain's construction represents, a reality that is physical rather than ideal, investigated by the methods of science rather than apprehended by the intellect alone. That both the Platonic framework and the contemporary science recognize a reality beyond the appearances is a striking relationship, even as they differ profoundly about whether that reality is the eternal forms or the physical world, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The framework received its most rigorous philosophical development in the work of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in the 18th century articulated the distinction between the world as it appears to us and the world as it is in itself, the distinction between the phenomenon and the thing in itself. Kant's framework was developed not as a claim about the deceptiveness of the senses, like the cave, nor as a claim about a realm of forms beyond the physical world, but as a rigorous analysis of the conditions of any possible experience, an analysis of what must be true of the mind for experience to be possible at all, an analysis that arrived at the conclusion that the experienced world is necessarily shaped by the structures of the mind that experiences it. The framework distinguished the phenomenon, the world as it appears to us, shaped by the structures of our minds, from the thing in itself, the world as it is independent of our perception of it, and it held that we can know only the phenomenon, only the world as it appears to us, never the thing in itself, which lies forever beyond our knowledge. Kant argued, in his Critique of Pure Reason published in 1781, that we never perceive the world as it is in itself, but only the world as it appears to us, the appearance being shaped by the structures of our own minds, the mind contributing the forms of space and time and the categories through which alone the world can be experienced, so that the experienced world is shaped by the mind's own structures and is not the world as it is in itself. Kant's argument marked a turning point in the history of philosophy, sometimes called his Copernican revolution, since it reversed the ordinary assumption that our knowledge must conform to the objects, proposing instead that the objects, as we experience them, must conform to the structures of our minds, the experienced world being shaped by the mind that experiences it, rather than simply imposing itself on a passive mind. Kant argued that space and time are not features of the world as it is in itself, but forms that the mind imposes on experience, the necessary forms of any experience for a mind like ours, so that the world as we experience it, the world in space and time, is the world as it appears to us rather than the world as it is in itself. The mind does not find space and time in the world, but brings them to the world, space and time being the forms within which alone the mind can experience anything, so that everything we experience is experienced as being in space and time, not because the world in itself is spatial and temporal, but because space and time are the forms the mind imposes on whatever it experiences. The framework held that the thing in itself, the world as it is, independent of our perception of it, lies forever beyond our knowledge, since we can know only the world as it appears to us, shaped by the structures of our minds, never the world as it is in itself, which lies beyond the appearances that are all we can ever know. The contemporary science has established that the experienced world is shaped by the structures of the brain, that the brain contributes the framework within which alone the world can be experienced, that the experienced world is the world as it appears to a brain like ours, rather than the world as it is in itself. The brain, like the Kantian mind, contributes the framework within which the world is experienced, the experienced world being shaped by the structures and the processing of the brain, so that the world as we experience it is the world as it appears to a brain with our particular structures rather than the world as it is in itself. A creature with a differently structured brain experiencing a differently structured world from the same reality. The relationship between the Kantian framework of the phenomenon and the thing in itself, and the contemporary scientific recognition that the experienced world is shaped by the structures of the brain, is striking. Even as the Kantian framework articulates the shaping in the terms of the forms and categories of the mind, while the contemporary science articulates it in the terms of the structures of the brain, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The Kantian framework is, of all the Western frameworks, perhaps the closest in its structure to the contemporary scientific recognition, both holding that the experienced world is shaped by the structures of the perceiver, that we experience not the world as it is in itself, but the world as it appears to a perceiver with structures like ours, the experienced world being shaped by the contributions of the mind or the brain. There is nonetheless a difference, for the Kantian framework holds that the thing in itself is forever unknowable, lying permanently beyond the appearances that are all we can know, While the contemporary science holds that the physical world beyond the construction, though never directly perceived, can be investigated indirectly through the methods of science, the science building an increasingly detailed picture of the world beyond the appearances, even though it is never directly perceived. That the Kantian framework and the contemporary science both recognize the experienced world as shaped by the structures of the perceiver is a striking relationship, even as they differ about whether the reality beyond the appearances is forever unknowable or can be investigated indirectly, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The Christian tradition articulated its own recognition that our present vision of reality is dim and partial, that we see now only in part, and that a clearer vision awaits. The recognition expressed most memorably in the words of Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians. The Christian framework approached the relationship between the appearances and the reality, not primarily through a philosophical analysis of perception, but through the recognition that the present human condition is one of limited and partial vision, a condition in which the fullness of reality, and above all the fullness of the divine reality, is not yet directly seen but is glimpsed only partially and indirectly, awaiting a future state in which it will be seen fully and directly. The framework thus located the limitation of the present vision in the human condition and anticipated its overcoming in a future transformation, the present partial vision being a feature of the present state rather than a permanent feature of the human relationship to reality. Paul wrote that we see now through a glass darkly, that our present knowledge is partial, that we know now only in part, but that we shall see face to face and shall know fully, the present dim and indirect vision giving way to a future clear and direct one. The image of seeing through a glass darkly, seeing through a clouded or imperfect medium rather than directly, captured the recognition that the present vision of reality is indirect and partial, mediated by something that obscures and distorts, the fullness of clear and direct vision being reserved for a future state. The image has resonated across the centuries as an expression of the recognition that our present grasp of reality is partial and indirect, that we do not now see clearly and fully, but as through a clouded medium, that a clearer vision awaits. The framework articulated the recognition that the present vision of reality is indirect and partial, a seeing as through a dim and clouded glass rather than a direct and clear seeing, the fullness of vision being reserved for a future state in which the present obscurity will be removed and the reality seen clearly and directly. The framework located the limitation not in the structures of the mind, nor in the nature of the appearances, but in the present condition of the human being, a condition of partial and indirect vision that awaits a future transformation in which the reality will be seen face to face. The present dim seeing being a feature of the present condition rather than a permanent limitation. The framework bears on the recognition that our present perception of reality is indirect, a seeing through a medium rather than a direct contact with the reality, the experienced world being a kind of dim and partial image of a reality that is not directly seen. The image of the glass, the medium through which we see darkly, captures precisely the situation that the contemporary science describes, the brain's construction being the medium through which alone we perceive the world, the glass through which we see the reality darkly rather than face to face, our vision of the world being always through this medium and never a direct and unmediated contact with the reality itself. The contemporary science has established that our perception of reality is indirect, mediated by the construction that the brain builds, the experienced world being the brain's model rather than the reality directly seen. We do not see the reality directly, but through the medium of the brain's construction, the construction standing between us and the reality, as a clouded glass stands between the eye and what lies beyond it. Our vision of the reality being mediated and indirect rather than direct, a seeing through the medium of the construction rather than a direct contact with the reality itself. The relationship between the Christian recognition of the present vision as dim and indirect, and the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as indirect and mediated is striking. Even as the Christian framework articulates the indirectness in the terms of the present condition awaiting transformation, while the contemporary science articulates it in the terms of the brain's construction, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the present vision of reality is indirect and partial, a seeing through a medium rather than a direct contact, runs through the Christian tradition in the image of seeing through a glass darkly, the present condition being one of partial and mediated vision, rather than direct and full seeing. That the Christian tradition recognized the present vision as dim and indirect, mediated rather than direct, and that the contemporary science has established that perception is indirect and mediated by the brain's construction, is a striking relationship, even as the Christian framework understands the indirectness in the terms of the present condition, awaiting a future clarity, and the science understands it in the terms of the brain's construction, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The frameworks differ in their account of whether and how the obscurity might be overcome, the Christian framework anticipating a future transformation in which the reality will be seen face to face. The contemporary science holding that perception will always be mediated by the brain's construction, while allowing that the methods of science can investigate the reality beyond the construction indirectly, the difference being genuine and not to be dissolved. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages with the frameworks that the great traditions of the East have developed for understanding the relationship between the appearances and the reality, and the synthesis of all that the investigation has explored. The next stage will examine the frameworks that the great traditions of the East have developed. The framework of Maya, in which the world as it appears is a kind of appearance or projection that conceals the deeper reality. The framework of the mind only, in which the experienced world is the construction of consciousness. The framework of the world as a transformation within the patterns of the cosmos. The Eastern frameworks will prove to bear in striking ways on the contemporary recognition that the experienced world is the brain's construction. The framework of Maya in particular, resonating with the recognition that the world as it appears is not the world as it is, even as the Eastern frameworks differ profoundly from one another and from the Western frameworks, and from the science about what lies beyond the appearances, the differences being genuine and not to be dissolved into a false harmony. The final stage will bring together all that the investigation has explored, the contemporary science of perception as construction, and the frameworks of the traditions of the West and the East, into a synthesis that examines what the convergences and the genuine differences might mean for the question of what the world is really like, and whether you have ever perceived it as it is. The recognition that the great traditions of the West insisted that the world you see is not the real world, that the appearances are a veil or shadow or construction that conceals a deeper reality. The framework of the cave and the framework of the thing in itself and the framework of the dim and partial vision is the recognition that this stage has explored. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, constructing the only world you will ever directly know, and the traditions of the West held that this world is not the real world, but an appearance that conceals it. The question of what the real world is like, beyond the appearance, being the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The traditions of the West, arriving by philosophical reflection at a recognition that resonates with what the contemporary science has established through the study of the brain, insisted across 2,000 years that the world we perceive is not the deepest reality, that the appearances conceal a reality that the wise must seek beyond them, whether the eternal forms of Plato, or the thing in itself of Kant, or the fuller vision anticipated by the Christian tradition. What the real world is like, beyond the appearance that the brain constructs and that the traditions held to conceal it, whether it can be known at all, and if so how, is the question that the recognition of perception as construction leaves open, the question that the Eastern traditions address through their own frameworks, the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The investigation continues. The East went further than the West and said that the world you see is not merely a veil over reality, but is, in a sense, made by the mind. Where the great traditions of the West held that the appearances conceal a reality beyond them, that the world we perceive is a shadow or an image or a dim glass through which a deeper reality is partially seen, the great traditions of the East developed frameworks in which the experienced world is more radically the construction of the mind, the world as it appears being a kind of appearance or projection that the mind itself produces, the reality being either a deeper ground that the appearances conceal, or, in the most radical frameworks, nothing other than mind itself. The previous stage is established, through the contemporary science, that the experienced world is the brain's construction, and they examined the Western frameworks that recognize the appearances as concealing a reality beyond them. The Eastern frameworks press the recognition further, in some cases holding not merely that the appearances conceal a reality, but that the experienced world is itself the production of the mind, the externality and the independence of the perceived world being themselves constructions, the world as it appears being more thoroughly the mind's own production than the Western frameworks had held. These Eastern frameworks bear in striking ways on the contemporary recognition that the experienced world is the brain's construction, the framework of Maya resonating with the recognition that the world as it appears is not the world as it is, the framework of mind only resonating with the recognition that the experienced world is a construction. But the frameworks differ profoundly from one another and from the contemporary science, and the differences must be articulated honestly, rather than dissolved into a false harmony, the resemblances being striking, but the frameworks remaining distinct, each making its own claim about what the experienced world is and what, if anything, lies beyond it. This stage will examine the Eastern frameworks for the relationship between the appearances and the reality, the Hindu framework of Maya, the Buddhist framework of mind only and the analysis of perception, and the Daoist framework of the world as transformation, with attention to the genuine differences among them and from the science. The Eastern frameworks are not, taken together, a single Eastern view to be set against the Western frameworks or the science, but are themselves distinct, the Hindu framework of Maya differing from the Buddhist framework of mind only, which differs in turn from the Daoist recognition of relativity, the frameworks of the East being as distinct from one another as they are from the frameworks of the West, the differences among them being as significant as any difference between East and West. The contemporary science has established that the experienced world is a construction of the brain, a model that the brain builds and that stands between the perceiver and the physical world. The Eastern traditions arrived at the recognition that the experienced world is in some sense the construction or projection of the mind, and the relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition and the Eastern frameworks is striking, even as the frameworks differ profoundly from one another and from the science, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The resemblance between the Eastern recognition that the experienced world is the mind's construction and the contemporary recognition that the experienced world is the brain's construction is striking, perhaps more striking than any resemblance the investigation has yet encountered. The Eastern frameworks having arrived through contemplative reflection at a recognition that resonates closely with what the contemporary science has established through the study of the brain. But the resemblance must not be allowed to obscure the genuine differences which this stage will articulate honestly, for the Eastern frameworks differ profoundly from one another and from the science about what the construction is and what, if anything, lies beyond it. The resemblance in the recognition of the world as construction, concealing deep differences that the honest engagement with the traditions must not dissolve. The Hindu tradition articulated the framework of Maya, The recognition that the world as it ordinarily appears is a kind of appearance that conceals the deeper reality, that the ordinary perception of the world as a manifold of separate things is a kind of veil over the deeper unity of reality. The term Maya is sometimes translated as illusion, though this translation can mislead, for the framework does not hold that the world is simply unreal, a mere nothing, but that the world as it ordinarily appears, as a manifold of separate and independent things, is an appearance that conceals the deeper reality of the one Brahman, the appearance being real as an appearance while concealing the deeper reality. Neither simply real in the way it appears nor simply unreal, but an appearance superimposed upon the reality. The framework was developed with particular rigor in the school of Advaita Vedanta, articulated most influentially by the philosopher Shankara in approximately the 8th century of the Common Era, who articulated Maya as the power by which the one reality of Brahman appears as the manifold world of separate things, the ordinary perception of the world as a manifold of separate things, being a kind of appearance superimposed upon the deeper reality of the one Brahman. Shankara articulated the relationship between the appearance and the reality through the analogy of the rope mistaken for a snake, in which a person in dim light mistakes a coiled rope for a snake, the snake being an appearance superimposed upon the rope, vanishing when the rope is seen clearly, the snake never having been there at all, but having been projected onto the rope by the mind in its ignorance. So too, on the framework, the manifold world of separate things is an appearance superimposed upon the one reality of Brahman, projected onto it by the ignorance that fails to perceive the underlying unity, the manifold world vanishing as a separate reality when the one Brahman is recognized, the appearance being seen through to the reality it had concealed. The framework held that the ordinary perception of the world is shaped by a fundamental ignorance, a failure to perceive the deeper reality. The world as it ordinarily appears being a kind of appearance produced by this ignorance, the deeper reality of the one Brahman being concealed by the appearance of the manifold world. The framework held that the liberation from this ignorance consists in the recognition of the deeper reality beneath the appearance, the recognition that the manifold world of separate things is an appearance, and that the deeper reality is the one Brahman, the appearance being seen through to the reality it conceals. The contemporary science has established that the experienced world is a construction that conceals the reality it represents, that we perceive not the reality directly, but the construction the brain builds. The relationship between the Hindu framework of Maya and the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as construction is striking. Even as the Hindu framework articulates the appearance as the veiling of the one Brahman, while the contemporary science articulates the construction as the brain's model of the physical world, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The two frameworks agree that the world as it ordinarily appears is not the deepest reality, that the ordinary perception conceals rather than reveals the reality, that there is a deeper truth than the world of separate things that the sense is present, but they differ profoundly about what the deeper reality is, the Hindu framework locating it in the one Brahman, the spiritual reality of which the manifold world is an appearance, while the contemporary science locates the reality in the physical world, the world of matter and energy that the brain's construction represents, the manifold world of separate things being, for the science, a real feature of the physical world rather than an appearance to be seen through. The difference is profound, for the Hindu framework holds the manifold of separate things to be ultimately an appearance concealing the one reality, while the science holds the manifold of separate things to be a real feature of the physical world. The two frameworks differing about whether the manifold world is appearance or reality, even as they agree that the ordinary perception does not reach the deepest truth. That both frameworks recognize the ordinary perception as not reaching the deepest reality is a striking relationship, even as they differ profoundly about what that reality is, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The Buddhist tradition developed an analysis of perception of remarkable depth, examining in detail the process by which the experienced world is constructed, and in some of its schools developing the radical framework that the experienced world is nothing other than mind. The Buddhist tradition, more than any other before the contemporary science, devoted sustained attention to the detailed analysis of the process of perception, examining the stages through which the raw contact of the senses with their objects gives rise to the elaborated experience of a world of objects, distinguishing the moments of the process and analyzing how the experienced world is built up through them, an analysis remarkable for its detail and its anticipation of the contemporary recognition that perception is a constructive process. The Buddhist analysis of perception examined the process by which the raw sensory contact gives rise to the elaborated experience of a world of objects. The process passing through stages of contact and sensation and perception and conceptual elaboration, the experienced world of objects being the product of this process of construction rather than a simple given. The analysis held that the experienced world is built up through these stages, the raw contact being elaborated through sensation and perception and conceptual construction into the experienced world of named and categorized objects, the elaborated world being a construction produced through the process rather than a simple registration of what is given. The conceptual elaboration, in particular, adding a great deal that is not in the raw contact, the experienced world of distinct and named and categorized objects being substantially the product of the mind's construction. The framework of the school known as Yogacara, or mind only, sometimes called Citta-matra, developed the radical recognition that the experienced world is nothing other than mind, that the objects we take to be external and independent are in fact constructions of consciousness, that the apparent externality and independence of the objects is itself a construction, the experienced world being a projection of the mind rather than an external world that the mind perceives. The Yogacara framework, articulated by such figures as Vasubandhu in approximately the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, held that the experienced world is a transformation of consciousness, that what we take to be external objects are appearances within consciousness, that the duality of the perceiving subject and the perceived object is itself a construction within consciousness, rather than a fundamental feature of reality. Vasubandhu argued, in works examining the nature of the experienced world, that the appearance of an external world can be accounted for without positing any external objects at all, drawing on the analogy of the dream, in which a whole world of apparent objects is experienced vividly without there being any external objects corresponding to them, the dream demonstrating that consciousness can produce the appearance of an external world from its own resources without any external world being required. The dream analogy was central to the argument, for in a dream one experiences a vivid world of apparent objects, of places and people and events, all experienced as external and independent, and yet none of it corresponds to any external reality, the whole being produced by the mind from its own resources, the dream demonstrating that the mind is capable of producing the full appearance of an external world without any external world being present. If the mind can produce the appearance of an external world in dream, the argument ran, then the appearance of an external world in waking life need not require an external world either, the waking world being, on the framework, a transformation of consciousness comparable to the dream, the appearance of externality being produced by consciousness rather than evidence of a world beyond it. So too, on the framework, the waking experience of an external world is a transformation of consciousness, the appearance of external objects being produced by consciousness from its own resources, the apparent externality of the objects being itself an appearance within consciousness, rather than evidence of a world outside it. The framework held that the deepest level of consciousness, sometimes called the storehouse consciousness, contains the seeds or dispositions from which the experienced world is continuously produced, the experienced world arising from these seeds as a dream arises from the sleeping mind, the world being a transformation of consciousness rather than an external reality that consciousness perceives. The storehouse consciousness, on the framework, holds the accumulated dispositions left by past experience and action, and from these dispositions the experienced world is continuously produced, each moment of experience arising from the seeds and in turn leaving new seeds, the experienced world being continuously generated from the depths of consciousness rather than received from an external world, the whole process being a transformation of consciousness within itself. This framework bears a striking resemblance to the contemporary recognition that the experienced world is continuously generated by the brain from its own predictive resources, the storehouse of dispositions resembling in a certain structural way the brain's accumulated model from which it generates its predictions, though the resemblance must not be allowed to obscure the profound difference that the framework denies the external world that the science affirms. The contemporary science has established that the experienced world is a construction, that the objects we perceive are the brain's models, that the experienced world is generated by the brain rather than simply received from outside. The relationship between the Buddhist framework of mind only and the contemporary scientific recognition that the experienced world is a construction is striking, even as the Buddhist framework articulates the construction as the transformation of consciousness, while the contemporary science articulates it as the brain's model of the physical world, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The resemblance is striking, both frameworks holding that the experienced world is a construction, that the objects we take to be external are produced rather than simply received, that the apparent externality of the world is itself in some sense a construction. But the difference is equally profound and must not be obscured, for the radical Buddhist framework of mind only holds, in its strongest form, that there is no external world at all, that the experienced world is nothing other than mind, the appearance of an external world being a construction of consciousness with no external reality corresponding to it, while the contemporary science affirms a physical world beyond the brain's construction, a real world of matter and energy that exists independently of the perceiver and that the construction represents. This is a profound difference, the one framework denying any external world and the other affirming one. The resemblance in the recognition of the world as construction, concealing the deep difference about whether there is an external reality beyond the construction at all. It should be noted that not all Buddhist schools held the radical mind-only view, and that the interpretation of the mind-only framework has been debated within the tradition itself, some understanding it as the denial of any external world, and others understanding it in a less radical way, as a claim about the centrality of mind to experience rather than the outright denial of an external world. But in its most radical form, the framework denies the external world that the science affirms, and this difference, where it holds, is profound. The resemblance in the recognition of the world as construction concealing a deep difference about whether anything exists beyond the mind. That both frameworks recognize the experienced world as a construction is a striking relationship, even as they differ profoundly about whether there is an external physical world beyond the construction, and the relationship between them remains a matter for reflection. The genuine differences between the Eastern frameworks and the contemporary science must be articulated honestly, since the resemblances, striking as they are, can mislead if the differences are not equally recognized. It is precisely because the resemblances are so striking, because the Eastern recognition that the experienced world is the mind's construction resonates so closely with the contemporary recognition that the experienced world is the brain's construction, that the differences must be articulated with particular care, lest the striking resemblances lead to the false conclusion that the frameworks are identical. The contemporary science holds that the experienced world is a construction of the brain, but that there is a physical world beyond the construction, a real world of matter and energy that the construction represents, however imperfectly, the construction being the brain's model of a physical reality that exists independently of the perceiver. The science is, in this respect, realist about the physical world, holding that there is a real physical world beyond the construction, that the construction represents this world, that the world would continue to exist if there were no perceivers, the construction being the brain's model of a mind-independent physical reality. The Hindu framework of Maya holds that the appearance conceals not a physical world, but the one reality of Brahman, the deeper reality being not the physical world that the science investigates, but the spiritual reality of the one Brahman, the appearance being the veiling of this spiritual reality rather than the brain's model of a physical world. Where the science holds that the construction represents a physical world of matter and energy, the Hindu framework holds that the appearance veils a spiritual reality, the one Brahman, the deeper reality being not physical but spiritual, not the world that the methods of science investigate, but the reality that contemplative realization discloses. This is a profound difference about the nature of the reality beyond the appearances, the science locating it in the physical world, and the Hindu framework locating it in the spiritual reality of Brahman, the two differing not merely in the terms they use, but in what they hold the deepest reality to be. The Buddhist framework of mind only holds, in its most radical form, that there is no external physical world at all, that the experienced world is nothing other than mind, a view that differs profoundly from the contemporary science, which affirms a physical world beyond the construction. These are not the same view articulated in different terms, but genuinely different frameworks. The contemporary science affirming a physical world beyond the construction, the Hindu framework affirming a spiritual reality beneath the appearance, the radical Buddhist framework denying any external world beyond the mind. To dissolve these differences into a vague harmony, to suppose that the science and the traditions are all saying the same thing, is to do violence to the distinct claims that each framework makes. The resemblance that the experienced world is a construction, concealing the profound differences about what, if anything, lies beyond the construction. There is a strong temptation, particularly in the modern encounter between the science and the contemplative traditions, to suppose that they have all arrived at the same recognition, that the contemporary science has confirmed what the traditions taught, that the framework of Maya and the framework of mind only and the contemporary neuroscience are all expressions of a single insight. This temptation must be resisted, for it obscures the genuine differences that this stage has articulated, the differences about what lies beyond the construction, the science affirming a physical world, the Hindu framework affirming a spiritual reality, the radical Buddhist framework denying any external world at all. These are not the same claim in different words, but genuinely different, and in some cases directly opposed claims. The affirmation of a physical world beyond the construction and the denial of any external world being directly opposed, the location of the deeper reality in the physical world and in the one Brahman being genuinely different. The resemblances are real and striking, the recognition that the experienced world is a construction being shared across the frameworks, and they are worth recognizing and reflecting upon. But the differences are equally real, and to honor the traditions and the science alike is to recognize both the resemblances and the differences, neither dissolving the differences into a false harmony, nor dismissing the striking resemblances, holding both the convergence and the genuine difference in view. The relationship between the Eastern frameworks and the contemporary science is striking in the resemblances and genuine in the differences, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection that must honor the differences as much as the resemblances. The Daoist tradition approached the relationship between the appearances and the reality differently from both the Hindu and the Buddhist frameworks, less through the analysis of perception or the doctrine of the veiling of reality than through the recognition of the limitation and relativity of the ordinary perspective, the recognition that the way things appear depends on the perspective from which they are perceived. The Daoist framework did not develop a doctrine of Maya veiling the one reality, nor a detailed analysis of perception as construction, nor a doctrine of mind only, but approached the relationship between the appearances and the reality through the recognition that the ordinary perceptions and distinctions are relative to a perspective, that the way the world appears depends on the standpoint from which it is perceived, that the ordinary human perspective is one among many and not the absolute truth about the world. The framework was articulated through the writings associated with the philosopher Zhuangzi in approximately the 4th century before the Common Era, who articulated through parable and paradox the recognition that the ordinary distinctions and perceptions are relative to a perspective, that what appears large from one perspective appears small from another, that what appears real from within a dream is recognized as a dream upon waking, the perspectives being relative and the ordinary perception being one perspective among many rather than the absolute truth. Zhuangzi articulated the famous parable of the butterfly dream, in which he dreamed he was a butterfly and, upon waking, could not be certain whether he was a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming he was a man. The parable, suggesting the difficulty of establishing which perspective is the waking reality and which the dream, the perspectives being relative and the certainty of the ordinary perspective being undermined. The parable does not resolve into a doctrine that the world is a dream, nor into a doctrine that it is not, but holds open the question, undermining the easy certainty that the ordinary waking perspective is the reality and the dream, the mere appearance, suggesting that from within a perspective one cannot be certain that it is the waking reality rather than a dream, the perspectives being relative and the certainty of any one of them being undermined. Zhuangzi articulated elsewhere the relativity of the distinctions of large and small, of useful and useless, of right and wrong, showing how each appears differently from different perspectives, how what is large from one perspective is small from another, how the distinctions that seem absolute are relative to a perspective, the ordinary perceptions and judgments being relative to a standpoint rather than absolute truths about the world. The framework counseled a recognition of the relativity and limitation of the ordinary perspective, a holding of the ordinary perceptions lightly in the recognition that they are relative to a perspective, an openness to the larger view from which the ordinary distinctions appear as relative rather than absolute. The contemporary science has established that perception is relative to the structures of the perceiver, that a differently structured perceiver would experience a differently structured world, that the ordinary human perception is one way of constructing the world rather than the absolute truth about it. A creature with different senses, sensitive to different ranges of the physical signals, would construct a different experienced world from the same physical reality. The bat experiencing a world built from echoes, the bee experiencing a world that includes the ultraviolet patterns invisible to us, each creature constructing its own experienced world from the same physical reality according to its own structures, no one of these experienced worlds being the absolute truth about the world, each being one way of constructing it. The ordinary human perception is, on this recognition, one perspective among the many possible perspectives, one way of constructing the world among the ways that differently structured perceivers construct it, not the absolute truth about the world, but one perspective relative to the human structures, a recognition that resonates with the Daoist recognition of the relativity of the ordinary perspective. The relationship between the Daoist recognition of the relativity of perspective and the contemporary scientific recognition that perception is relative to the perceiver is striking. Even as the Daoist framework articulates the relativity in the terms of the perspectives within the Tao, while the contemporary science articulates it in the terms of the structures of the perceiver, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the ordinary perception is one perspective among many rather than the absolute truth, that a differently situated perceiver would perceive differently, that the ordinary distinctions are relative to a standpoint, runs through the Daoist tradition, which counselled the holding of the ordinary perceptions lightly in the recognition of their relativity, that the Daoist tradition recognized the relativity of the ordinary perspective, and that the contemporary science has established that perception is relative to the structures of the perceiver. A differently structured perceiver, experiencing a differently structured world, is a striking relationship. Even as the Daoist framework understands the relativity in the terms of the perspectives within the Tao, and the science understands it in the terms of the structures of the perceiver, and the relationship between the two remains a matter for reflection. The investigation will conclude in the final stage with the synthesis of all that it has explored, the contemporary science of perception as construction, and the frameworks of the traditions of the West and the East, into a reflection on what the convergences and the genuine differences might mean for the question of what the world is really like and whether you have ever perceived it as it is. The final stage will bring together the contemporary science that establishes the experienced world as the brain's construction, the Western frameworks of the cave and the thing in itself and the dim glass, and the Eastern frameworks of Maya and mind only and the relativity of perspective, into a synthesis that examines the threads that have run through the investigation, the genuine objections and difficulties, and what all of it might mean for the question of what the world is really like beneath the construction. The synthesis will not attempt to dissolve the genuine differences among the frameworks into a false harmony, nor to declare that the contemporary science has confirmed one framework or another, but will examine honestly what the convergences and the genuine differences might mean, holding open the question of what the world is really like, rather than closing it with a false resolution. The recognition that the great traditions of the East developed frameworks in which the experienced world is more radically the construction or projection of the mind, the Hindu framework of Maya and the Buddhist framework of mind only, and the Daoist recognition of the relativity of perspective, the frameworks differing profoundly from one another and from the science about what lies beyond the construction, is the recognition that this stage has explored. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, constructing the only world you will ever directly know, and the traditions of the East held that this world is in some sense the construction of the mind. Whether the veiling of a deeper reality or the projection of consciousness itself, the question of what lies beyond the construction being the question that the investigation will bring to its synthesis. The traditions of the East, arriving by contemplative reflection at a recognition that resonates closely with what the contemporary science has established through the study of the brain, held that the experienced world is the construction of the mind, whether Maya veiling the one Brahman, or the transformation of consciousness in the framework of mind only, or one perspective among many in the Daoist recognition of relativity. What lies beyond the construction, whether a physical world or a spiritual reality, or nothing other than mind, whether it can be known, and if so how, is the question that the science and the traditions answer differently, the question that the investigation will bring to its synthesis, holding open the genuine differences rather than dissolving them into a false harmony. The investigation continues. You have never once seen the world as it is, and you have spent this entire investigation discovering what this means and what it does not. When the investigation began, the claim that you have never seen the real world might have seemed a mere provocation, a striking overstatement to be qualified away, but the investigation has not qualified it away. It has established it through the contemporary science of perception, and it has set it beside the recognitions of the great contemplative traditions, which arrive by their own roots at the recognition that the world as it appears is not the world as it is. And yet the investigation has also discovered what the claim does not mean, for it does not mean that the world is unreal, or that perception cannot be trusted, or that there is no world beyond the construction. The recognition that you have never directly seen the world being compatible with there being a real world that the construction represents, a world that the construction generally tracks reliably, even though it never directly discloses it. The experience world is a construction of the brain, a model the brain builds inside the sealed darkness of the skull, assembled from signals that bear no resemblance to the experience they produce, generated as a prediction that the signal's correct. A controlled hallucination that usually matches the world well enough to be useful, but that can go wrong without the brain being able to tell. This final stage will bring together all that the investigation has explored, drawing out the threads that have run through it, articulating honestly the objections and difficulties that any conclusion must face, and reflecting on what all of it might mean for the question of what the world is really like, and whether you have ever perceived it as it is, while leaving that question open rather than closing it with a false resolution. The investigation has examined 4 threads: the recognition that perception is a construction, the recognition that the construction is a prediction, the recognition that the prediction can go wrong, and the question of what lies beyond the construction. And this synthesis will draw the 4 threads together before turning to the objections and to the genuine possibilities among which you must find your own way. The investigation has not aimed to tell you what to conclude about the deepest question, the question of what the world is really like beneath the construction, but to lay out honestly what the contemporary science has established and what the great traditions have held, the convergences and the genuine differences, so that you might find your own way through the question with the science and the traditions before you. The contemporary science establishes that the experienced world is the brain's construction, that you perceive the model rather than the world directly, even as it affirms that there is a physical world beyond the construction that the construction represents. The traditions set beside this their frameworks of the appearances and the reality, the cave and the thing in itself and the dim glass, the Maya and the mind only, and the relativity of perspective, and the relationship between the contemporary science and the frameworks of the traditions is striking, even as the traditions differ profoundly from one another and from the science, and any bridge between the science and any of the traditions is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The question that this investigation has examined connects to questions that other investigations have explored. The question of the relationship between the appearances and the reality being one of the deepest and most recurrent in the examination of the mind and the world. The investigation into the observer and the role of observation in what is observed, the investigation into the constructed nature of the self, the investigation into the world of dreams that the brain generates from within, all bear on the question that this investigation has examined. The question of how much of the world we experience is contributed by the mind and how much is given by the world. The recognition that the experienced world is the brain's construction connects to the recognition in other investigations that the boundary between the mind and the world is less clear than it seems, that the mind contributes more to the experienced world than common sense supposes, that the world we experience is shaped by the mind that experiences it. The first thread that has run through the investigation is the recognition that perception is a construction, that the experienced world is built by the brain rather than directly received. This was the recognition with which the investigation began. The recognition that you have never directly perceived the world but only the model your brain builds, that the rich world of colours and sounds and solid objects is the brain's construction rather than the world directly seen. It is the foundational thread, the recognition on which all the others rest, the recognition that perception is not the passive reception of the world as it is, but the active construction of a model of the world. The contemporary science established this through the recognition that the brain is sealed in the darkness of the skull, receiving only electrical signals that bear no resemblance to the rich world of experience, constructing the entire experience world from these signals, the colours and sounds and solid objects, being the brain's construction rather than properties of the world directly perceived. a recognition with roots in the 19th century work of Hermann von Helmholtz on perception as unconscious inference, and in the 17th century distinction of Galileo and Locke between the primary qualities and the secondary qualities that exist only in the perceiving mind. The recognition that the rich world of experience is constructed by the brain from signals that bear no resemblance to it, that the redness and the sound and the solidity are the brain's contributions rather than properties of the world directly perceived, was the foundation on which the whole investigation was built. The recognition that you have never directly perceived the world, but only the construction the brain assembles from the signals. The traditions recognize that the experienced world is in some sense a construction or appearance, that the world as it appears is not the world as it is, that the mind contributes to the world it experiences. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as construction and the traditional recognition that the appearances are not the reality is striking. Even as the science articulates the construction in the terms of the neuroscience, while the traditions articulate it in the terms of their various frameworks, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that perception is a construction leads to the question of how the construction is built, the first thread leading to the second. If the experienced world is a construction the brain builds, then the question arises of how the brain builds it, whether by assembling it from the signals or in some other way, and the answer that the investigation found, that the brain builds the experienced world as a prediction rather than by assembling it from the signals, was the second thread. The second thread is the recognition that the construction is a prediction, that the brain does not build the experienced world up from the signals but generates it as a prediction that the signals correct, the experienced world being the brain's best guess about the causes of the signals, a controlled hallucination kept in check by the signals. This thread deepened the first, for it established not merely that the experienced world is a construction, but that it is a particular kind of construction, a prediction generated by the brain from the top down rather than assembled from the signals from the bottom up, the signals serving to correct the prediction rather than to build the experience from scratch. The contemporary science established this through the framework of predictive processing, articulated through the work of Karl Friston on the free energy principle and the brain as a minimizer of prediction error, and through the work of Anil Seth on perception as a controlled hallucination, the experienced world being the brain's prediction as corrected by the signals rather than a construction assembled from the signals alone. This was a deepening of the first thread, for it established not merely that the experienced world is a construction, but that the construction is generated as a prediction, the brain reaching out ahead of the signals with its best guess about the world, and using the signals only to correct the guess, the experienced world being mostly the brain's prediction, with only the corrections coming from the world, a controlled hallucination generated by the brain and kept in check by the signals. The recognition that perception is prediction added to the disturbance, for it meant that the experienced world is shaped by the brain's expectations as much as by the signals, that we tend to perceive what we predict, the world we experience being in part a projection of our own expectations. The traditions recognize that the mind projects the world it experiences, that the experienced world is shaped by the mind's own expectations and habits and constructions, that the mind encounters not a bare world, but a world already shaped by its own activity. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition of perception as prediction and the traditional recognition of the mind as projecting the world it experiences is striking. Even as the science articulates the prediction in the terms of the predictive brain, while the traditions articulate the projection in the terms of the mind's construction, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection, rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the construction is a prediction leads to the question of what happens when the prediction goes wrong, the second thread leading to the third. If the experienced world is a prediction, a best guess, then a guess can be wrong, and the question arises of what happens when it is the answer that the investigation found, that the same predictive machinery that produces ordinary perception can produce experiences that depart from the world, and that the brain cannot tell from within the experience when this has happened, being the third thread. The third thread is the recognition that the prediction can go wrong, that the same predictive machinery that constructs the ordinary trustworthy world can construct experiences that depart from the world, and that the brain cannot tell from within the experience whether its guess is accurate or has gone wrong. This thread carried the recognition to its most disturbing point, for it established that the very machinery that constructs the trustworthy world can construct a world that departs from the world, that perception and its failures lie on a single continuum, the same predictive machinery producing the accurate perception and the phantom limb and the illusion and the profound departures from reality, the faulty guess indistinguishable from within the experience from the accurate one. The contemporary science established this through the phantom limb studied by Villayanur Ramachandran, through the placebo and nocebo effects in which the brain's predictions produce real bodily changes, through the illusions that reveal the assumptions built into perception, through the rubber hand illusion studied by Botvinnik and Cohen, and through the disorders of perception in which the predictive machinery produces profound departures from reality, all revealing that the faulty guess is experienced with the same conviction as the accurate one. This was the most disturbing of the threads, for it established that the brain cannot tell from within the experience whether its guess is accurate or has gone wrong. The phantom limb felt as vividly as a real limb, the placebo producing real benefit, the illusion persisting even when known to be an illusion, the faulty guess being experienced with exactly the same conviction and immediacy as the accurate one, so that you cannot tell from within your experience whether your perception is accurate or has departed from the world. The traditions recognize that the mind can be deceived about the nature of the world, that the appearances can mislead, that the ordinary perception of the world can itself be a kind of error that conceals the reality. The relationship between the contemporary scientific recognition that perception is vulnerable to systematic error and the traditional recognition that the mind is deceived by the appearances is striking, even as the science articulates the error in the terms of the predictive brain, while the traditions articulate the deception in the terms of the mind's error about the reality, and any bridge between them is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. The recognition that the prediction can go wrong, and that the brain cannot tell when it does, leads to the question of what the world is really like beneath the construction, and whether it can be known, the third thread leading to the fourth. If the experienced world is a construction, a prediction that can go wrong, that the brain cannot directly check against the reality, then the question arises of what the world is really like beneath the construction, and whether you can ever know, given that you have access only to the construction and never to the world directly, the question of what lies beyond the construction being the fourth thread, the question that the traditions answered in their profoundly different ways. The fourth thread is the question that the first three raise and that the traditions answered in their profoundly different ways. The question of what the world is really like beneath the construction, and whether you can ever know, given that you have access only to the construction and never to the world directly. This is the deepest thread, the question toward which the first three lead, the question that the recognition of perception as a fallible construction forces upon us, the question of what lies beyond the construction that you can never directly perceive, and whether it can be known at all. It is the question on which the science and the traditions divide, the science and the various traditions answering it in profoundly different, and in some cases directly opposed ways. The agreement that the appearances are not the whole reality giving way, when the question of what lies beyond the appearances is pressed to a profound divergence. The contemporary science holds that there is a physical world beyond the construction, a real world of matter and energy that the construction represents, and that the methods of science can investigate this world indirectly, building an increasingly detailed picture of the world beyond the appearances, even though it is never directly perceived. The science does not claim to perceive the world directly, for it recognizes that all perception is construction, but it holds that the methods of science, extending and disciplining perception through instruments and measurement and theory, can investigate the world beyond the appearances, indirectly, correcting for the distortions of perception, building a picture of the world that goes beyond what perception directly discloses, the physical world being knowable indirectly even though it is never directly perceived. The traditions answered the question in their profoundly different ways. The Platonic tradition locating the reality in the eternal forms apprehended by the intellect, the Kantian framework holding the thing in itself to be forever unknowable, the Christian tradition anticipating a fuller vision in a future transformation, the Hindu framework locating the reality in the one Brahman concealed by Maya, the radical Buddhist framework denying any external world beyond the mind, the Daoist tradition recognizing the relativity of every perspective. These answers differ profoundly from one another, and the differences must be honored rather than dissolved. The agreement that the appearances are not the whole reality concealing genuine and in some cases directly opposed claims about what, if anything, lies beyond the construction. It must be said plainly, as the investigation reaches its synthesis, that these frameworks cannot all be correct, that there either is or is not a physical world beyond the construction, that the deepest reality either is or is not the physical world, that the question of what lies beyond the appearances admits of genuinely opposed answers, among which the traditions and the science genuinely differ. The temptation to gather all the frameworks into a vague harmony, to suppose that the science has confirmed what the traditions taught, that the framework of Maya and the framework of the cave and the contemporary neuroscience are all expressions of a single insight, must be resisted to the end, for it does violence to the distinct claims that each framework makes. The affirmation of a physical world and the denial of any external world being directly opposed, the location of the reality in the physical world and in the one Brahman and in the eternal forms being genuinely different. The resemblances are real and striking. The recognition that the experienced world is a construction that does not directly disclose the reality being shared across the science and the traditions, and they are worth recognizing and reflecting upon. But the differences are equally real, and to honor the traditions and the science alike is to hold both the resemblances and the differences in view, neither dissolving the differences into a false harmony nor dismissing the striking resemblances. The relationship between the contemporary scientific affirmation of a physical world beyond the construction and the profoundly different answers of the traditions is striking, even as the traditions differ profoundly from one another, and the science establishes none of their answers, and any bridge between the science and any of the answers is a matter for reflection rather than something that the science itself establishes. Several objections must be stated honestly before the investigation reaches its close, since intellectual honesty requires that the difficulties facing any conclusion be acknowledged rather than concealed. It would be easy, having traced the four threads, to conclude that perception is so unreliable that we can know nothing of the world, that the gap between the experienced world and the world as it is in itself is so vast that we are sealed forever within an illusion. But this conclusion would move too quickly, would claim more than the investigation has established. They would mistake the recognition that perception is a construction for the conclusion that the construction is unreliable or that there is no world beyond it. The objections that follow do not establish what the world is really like, but they establish that the recognition that perception is a construction need not lead to a radical skepticism, that the construction can be reliable even though it is a construction, that there can be a knowable world beyond it, even though it is never directly perceived, the honest conclusion being not a verdict of skepticism, but an open question about how far the construction can be trusted and what lies beyond it. The first objection holds that the recognition that perception is a construction does not mean that perception is unreliable, or that the experienced world bears no relation to the reality. Since the construction is continuously corrected by the signals from the world and has been shaped by evolution to track the features of the world that matter for survival, so that the construction, though it is a construction that is generally well attuned to the world, the colours and sounds and objects of experience corresponding reliably, if not in their intrinsic character then in their structure, to real features of the world. The recognition that perception is a construction can seem to lead to the conclusion that perception is unreliable, that we cannot trust our perception of the world, but this conclusion does not follow, for a construction can be reliable, can track the world accurately, even though it is a construction, the construction being continuously corrected by the signals and shaped by evolution to be useful, the very survival of the organism, depending on the construction being generally well attuned to the features of the world that matter. The construction is not an arbitrary fantasy, but a construction disciplined by the world, corrected continuously by the signals and refined over evolutionary time, so that it generally tracks the world reliably. The recognition that it is a construction, not undermining its reliability, but only correcting the naive assumption that it is a direct and unmediated perception of the world as it is. The second objection holds that the recognition that the experienced world is a construction does not establish the more radical conclusion that there is no external world or that the external world is unknowable. Since the construction can be understood as the brain's model of a real external world that the methods of science can investigate, the recognition of perception as construction being compatible with a robust realism about the physical world and with the possibility of knowing it indirectly through the methods of science. That the experienced world is the brain's construction does not entail that there is nothing beyond the construction. For the construction can be the brain's model of a real external world, the recognition that we perceive the model rather than the world directly being compatible with there being a real world, that the model represents and that the methods of science can investigate. The move from the recognition that perception is construction to the denial of an external world being a move that the recognition itself does not warrant. The third objection holds that the gap between the experienced world and the world as it is in itself, though real, may be less significant than it first appears. Since what matters for living and for knowledge may be not the intrinsic character of the world but its structure, and the structure of the world may be reliably tracked by the construction, even if the intrinsic character of the world is never directly perceived. The construction, preserving the structure of the world, even as it represents that structure in the constructed qualities of experience. These objections do not resolve the question of what the world is really like, but they establish that the recognition of perception as construction need not lead to a radical skepticism or a denial of the external world. The question of how far the construction can be trusted and what lies beyond it remaining genuinely open. The recognition that perception is a construction, a prediction that can go wrong, is established by the contemporary science beyond serious doubt. But what this recognition means for the question of what the world is really like, whether it shows that we are sealed within an illusion or that we have a generally reliable, if indirect, access to a real world, whether the deepest reality is the physical world or something beyond it, are questions that the recognition does not settle, questions that remain open after the science has established all that it can establish about how perception works. The honest conclusion of the investigation is therefore not a verdict on what the world is really like, but a clarification of the question, a recognition of what the science has established about how perception works, and what it has left open about what lies beyond the construction, so that you might take up the open question with the genuine possibilities before you. What you make of all this is yours alone to determine, and the investigation closes not by telling you what to conclude, but by laying out the genuine possibilities among which you must find your own way. The investigation has not been a path to a predetermined conclusion, a demonstration designed to lead you to a particular view of what the world is really like. It has been an examination of what the contemporary science has established about how perception works, and what the great traditions have held about the relationship between the appearances and the reality, and it leaves you, at its close, with the genuine possibilities before you, the possibilities that the science and the traditions present, among which you must find your own way, the investigation having no authority to decide for you the deepest question about what lies beyond the construction. There are, broadly, 3 ways that one might take up the recognitions that the investigation has examined. 3 genuine possibilities about what lies beyond the construction, and the investigation will lay out these 3 before leaving the question with you. You might conclude, with the contemporary science, that there is a physical world beyond the construction, that the construction is the brain's model of this world, generally well attuned to it through evolution, and continuously corrected by the signals, and that the methods of science can investigate the world beyond the appearances, building an increasingly detailed picture of the reality that perception never directly discloses. On this view, the recognition that perception is a construction is not a cause for skepticism or despair, but a clarification of how perception works. The construction being a generally reliable model of a real physical world, the science extending and disciplining perception to investigate the world beyond the appearances, the gap between the experienced world and the world as it is being real, but bridgeable, indirectly, through the methods of science. You might conclude, with the Platonic and the Hindu and the Christian traditions in their different ways, that the deepest reality lies beyond the physical world that the science investigates, in the eternal forms, or the one Brahman, or the divine reality glimpsed now darkly and to be seen hereafter face to face, the construction concealing not merely a physical world, but a deeper spiritual reality. On this view, the recognition that the experienced world is a construction that conceals the reality opens onto the recognition of a deeper reality beyond not only the appearances but the physical world itself, the construction veiling a reality that is spiritual rather than physical, disclosed not by the methods of science but by the contemplative or philosophical or religious path that the traditions developed. The recognition that perception is a construction, on this view, is not the end of the matter but a beginning, a recognition that the world we ordinarily perceive is not the deepest reality, that there is a reality beyond not only the appearances but the physical world that the science investigates, a spiritual reality to be sought along the path that the traditions developed. Whether the philosophical assent to the forms, or the contemplative realization of Brahman, or the religious anticipation of the vision that is now dark and will be face to face, the traditions differ profoundly among themselves about what this deeper reality is, and the differences must not be dissolved, but they share the recognition that the deepest reality lies beyond the physical world, a recognition that goes beyond what the science establishes, and that you might make your own or might set aside. You might conclude, with the most radical of the idealist frameworks, that the very distinction between the construction and an external world beyond it is mistaken, that there is no external world beyond the mind, that the experienced world is the only world there is, though this conclusion sits uneasily with the contemporary science and with much of the contemplative tradition alike. On this view, the search for a world beyond the construction is misconceived from the start, for there is no world beyond the mind, the experienced world being the only world there is. The very notion of a reality beyond the mind that the construction represents being itself, a construction with nothing answering to it. This is the most radical of the conclusions, and it sits uneasily with the contemporary science, which affirms a physical world beyond the construction, and with much of the contemplative tradition, which affirms a spiritual reality beyond the appearances, though it has had its defenders among the idealist philosophers of both East and West, and it remains a genuine possibility that you might weigh, however uneasily it sits with the science and with much of the tradition. These are genuinely different conclusions, and the investigation does not decide among them, leaving the decision to you. The science has established how perception works, that the experienced world is the brain's construction, a prediction that can go wrong, and the traditions have offered their frameworks for what lies beyond the construction, and the genuine possibilities lie before you. The scientific affirmation of a knowable physical world, the traditional affirmation of a deeper spiritual reality, the radical idealist denial of any world beyond the mind. Which of these you make your own, or whether you hold the question open without deciding, is yours alone to determine, the investigation having aim not to decide for you, but to lay the question before you with the honesty it deserves. Your brain is locked in the dark vault of the skull, building the only world you will ever directly know, and whether that world resembles the reality beyond it, what that reality is, and whether you can ever know it, is the question that this investigation has examined and that you must answer for yourself. You have never once seen the world as it is. You have seen only the construction your brain builds, the controlled hallucination, the best guess. And yet here you are, in a world of colour and sound and solid things, the only world you have ever known. The question of what lies beyond it remaining, after all the investigation, genuinely and profoundly open. What you make of it is yours alone to determine.